The Wench is Dead by Colin Dexter. Intermittently on the Tuesday he felt sick. Frequently on the Wednesday he was sick. On the Thursday he felt sick frequently, but he was actually sick only intermittently. With difficulty early on the Friday morning, drained, listless and infinitely weary, he found the energy to drag himself from his bed to the telephone and seek to apologize to his superiors at Kidlington Police HQ for what was going to be an odds-on non-appearance at the office that late November day. When he awoke on the Saturday morning, he was happily aware that he was feeling considerably better. And indeed, as he sat in the kitchen of his bachelor flat in North Oxford, dressed in pyjamas as gaudily striped as a Lido deck chair, he was debating whether his stomach could cope with a wafer of Weetabix, when the phone rang. "Morse here," she said. "Good morning, sir. If you can hold the line a minute, Superintendent Strange would like a word with you. Just a moment, please." Morse said nothing, but he almost prayed, quite something for a low-church atheist, that Strange would get a move on and come to the phone and say whatever it was he'd got to say. Prickles of sweat were forming on his forehead, and his left hand plucked at his pyjama-top pocket for his handkerchief. "Ah, Morse, yes, sorry to hear you're a bit off colour, old boy. Lots of it about, you know. The wife's brother had it. When was it now? Oh, a fortnight or so back. No, to tell a lie, must have been 3 weeks at least. Still, that's neither here nor there, is it?" In enlarged globules, the prickles of sweat had reformed on Morse's forehead, and he wiped his brow once more as he mumbled a few dutifully appreciative noises into the telephone. Afterwards, Morse thought he remembered concluding the conversation in a seemly manner. He remembered passing a hand once more over a forehead that now felt very wet and very, very cold, and then taking 2 or 3 hugely deep breaths, and then starting to rush for the bathroom. It was Mrs. Green, the charlady, who came in on Tuesday and Saturday mornings, who rang treble 9 immediately and demanded an ambulance. She had found her employer sitting with his back to the wall in the entrance hall, conscious, seemingly sober, and passably presentable, except for the deep maroon stains down the front of his deck chair pyjamas. Stains that in both colour and texture served vividly to remind her of the dregs in the bottom of a coffee percolator. And she knew exactly what they meant, because that cruel doctor had made it quite plain, 5 years ago now it had been, that if only she'd called him immediately, Mr. Green might still... "Yes, that's right," she heard herself say. "Just on the southern side of the Banbury Road roundabout." At 10:15 that same morning, an only semi-reluctant Morse condescended to be helped into the back of the ambulance, where, bedroom-slippered and with an itchy grey blanket draped round a clean pair of pyjamas, he sat defensively opposite a middle-aged uniformed woman who appeared to have taken his refusal to lie down on the stretcher bed as a personal affront, and who now sullenly and silently pushed a white enamelled kidney bowl into his lap as he vomited copiously and noisily once more, while the ambulance climbed Headley Way, turned left into the grounds of the John Radcliffe Hospital complex, and finally stopped outside the Accident, Casualty and Emergency Department. As he lay supine on a hospital trolley now, it occurred to Morse that he might already have died some 6 times without anyone recording his departure. But he was always an impatient soul, and it might not have been quite so long as he imagined before a white-coated ancillary worker led him in leisurely fashion through a questionnaire that ranged from the names of his next of kin, in Morse's case now non-existent, to his denominational preferences, equally non-existent. Once through these initiation rites, Morse found himself the object of considerably increased attention. From somewhere a young nurse appeared, flipped a watch from her stiffly laundered lapel with her left hand, and took his pulse with her right, proceeded to take his blood pressure and his temperature, and then committed her findings to a chart, headed Morse, E. The kidney bowl had been left within easy reach, and Morse was retching violently, if unproductively, when a young houseman came to stand beside him and to scan the reports of ambulance operatives, administrative staff, and medical personnel. You've got a bit of a nasty tummy trouble. You realize that? Morse shrugged vaguely. I'm all right, really, he said, as he lay back and tried to loosen the knot that had tied itself tight inside his shoulder muscles. You're not all right, I'm afraid. At best, you've got a stomach ulcer that suddenly decided to burst out bleeding. Morse experienced a sharp little jerk of alarm in his diaphragm. And, at worst, you've got what we call a perforated ulcer. And if that is the case... If that is the case, repeated Morse weakly. But the young doctor made no immediate answer, and for the next few minutes prodded, squeezed, and kneaded the paunchy flesh around Morse's abdomen. Found anything? Queried Morse. Well, you could well lose a couple of stone. Your liver's enlarged. I thought you said it was the stomach. Oh, yes, it is. You've had a stomach hemorrhage. What? Oh, what's that got to do with my liver? Do you drink a lot, Mr. Morse? Well, I like a glass of beer, yeah. How many pints do you drink a week? A week? Squeaked Morse, his face clouding over like that of a child who has just been given a complex problem in mental multiplication. Well, a day, then, suggested the houseman helpfully. Morse divided by 3. 2 or 3, I suppose. Do you drink spirits? Occasionally. What spirits do you drink? Morse shrugged his tautened shoulders once again. Scotch. Sometimes I treat myself to a drop of scotch. How long would a bottle of scotch last you? Depends how big it is. But Morse immediately saw that his attempt at humour was ill-appreciated, and he swiftly multiplied by 3. Week? 10 days, about that. How many cigarettes do you smoke? 8, 10, replied Morse, getting the hang of things now and smoothly dividing by 3. Do you ever take any exercise? Walking, jogging, cycling, squash? Morse reached for the kidney bowl. As he vomited, this time productively, the houseman observed, with some alarm, the coffee grounds admixed with the telltale brightly crimson specks of blood. Blood that was deoxygenated daily with plentiful nicotine and liberally lubricated with alcohol. For some while after these events, Morse's mind was somewhat hazy. Later, however, he could recall a nurse bending over him, the same young nurse as earlier, and he could remember the beautifully manicured fingers on her left hand as she flipped the watch out again into her palm. Could almost follow her thoughts as with contracted brow she squinted at the disturbing equation between his half-minute pulse rate and the 30-second span upon her watch. At this point, Chief Inspector Morse knew that the wings of the Angel of Death had fluttered above his head, and he felt a sudden frisson of fear as, for the first time in his life, he began to think of dying. When Morse awoke the following morning, he was aware of a grey dawn through the window of the small ward to his left, and of a clock showing 4:50 a.m. on the wall above the archway to his right, through which he could see a slimly attractive nurse sitting in a pool of light behind a desk and writing in a large book. Was she writing, Morse wondered, about him? If so, there would be remarkably little to say, for apart from one very brief bout of vomiting in the small hours, he had felt, quite genuinely, so very much better, and had required no further attention. The tubing strapped to his right wrist and stretching up to the saline drip bottle hooked above his bed was still dragging uncomfortably against his skin most of the time, as if the needle had been stuck in slightly off-centre. But he'd determined to make no mention of such a minor irritant. The awkward apparatus rendered him immobile, of course, at least until he had mastered the skills of the young man from the adjacent bed, who had spent most of the previous evening wandering freely, as it seemed, all over the hospital, holding his own drip high above his head like some Ethiopian athlete brandishing the Olympic torch. Morse had felt most self-conscious when circumstances utterly beyond his control had finally induced him to beg for a bottle. Yet, thus far, he had been spared the undignified palaver of the dreaded pan, and he trusted that his lack of solid nutriment during the preceding days would be duly acknowledged with some reciprocal inactivity by his bowels. And so far, so good. The nurse was talking earnestly to a slightly built, fresh-faced young houseman, his white coat reaching almost to his ankles, a stethoscope hooked into his right-hand pocket. And soon the two of them were walking quietly, unfussily into the ward where Morse lay, and then disappearing behind the curtains, drawn across the previous evening, of the bed diagonally opposite. When Morse had first been wheeled into the ward, he had noticed the man who occupied the bed, a proud-looking man in his late 70s, perhaps, with an Indian Army moustache and a thin thatch of pure white hair. At the moment of entry, for a second or two, the old warrior's watery pale eyes had settled on Morse's face, seeming almost to convey some faint message of hope and comradeship. And indeed, the dying old man would certainly have wished the new patient well, had he been able to articulate his intent. But the rampaging septicemia, which had sent the bright pink suffusion to his waxen cheeks, had taken from him the power of speech. It was 5:20 a.m. when the houseman emerged from behind the curtains, 5:30 a.m. when the swiftly summoned porters had wheeled the dead man away. And when, exactly half an hour later, the full lights flickered on in the ward, the curtains round the bed of the late Colonel Wilfred Denniston, OBE, MC, were standing open in their normal way to reveal the newly laundered sheets with the changed blankets professionally mitered at the foot. At 6:45 a.m., Morse was aware of considerable activity, and Violet, a happily countenanced and considerably overweight West Indian woman, hove into view, pushing a tea trolley. This was the occasion clearly for a pre-dawn beverage, and how Morse welcomed it. For the first time in the past few days, he was conscious of a positive appetite for food and drink, and already, and with envy, he had surveyed the jugs of water and bottles of squash that stood on the bedside tables of his fellow patients, though for some reason not on the table of the man immediately opposite, one Walter Greenaway, above whose bed there hung a rectangular plaque bearing the sad little legend, "Nil by mouth." "Tea or coffee, Mr. Greenaway?" "I'll just settle for a large gin and tonic, if that's all right by you." "Ice and lemon?" No ice, thank you. It spoils the gin." Violet moved away massively to the next bed, leaving Mr. Greenaway sans ice, sans everything. Yet the perky 60-odd-year-old appeared far from mortified by his exclusion from the proceedings, and winked happily across at Morse. "All right, Chief?" "On the mend," said Morse cautiously. "Huh? That's exactly what the old Colonel used to say. On the mend. Poor old boy." I see," said Morse with some unease. "Same trouble as me?" inquired Greenaway confidentially. "Pardon?" "Stomach, is it?" "Oh, yeah, ulcer, so they say." "Mine's perforated." Greenaway proclaimed this fact with a certain grim pride and satisfaction. "They're operating on me at 10 o'clock. That's why I'm not allowed to drink, see?" "Oh," said Morse. And then a more important matter demanded his attention, for Violet had effected a U-turn and was at last, beside his bed. She greeted her new charge with a cheerful grin. "Morning, Mr. consulting the borrowed letters on the name tab. Mr. Morse." "Good morning," replied Morse. "I'll have some coffee, please. 2 spoonfuls of sugar." Mimes. Violet's eyes almost soared out of their whitened sockets towards the ceiling. Then she turned to share the private joke with the grinning Greenaway. She wagged a brown forefinger at a point somewhere above the bed. Twisting his neck, Morse saw, behind his saline apparatus, a rectangular plaque bearing the sad little legend, "Nil by mouth." Detective Sergeant Lewis came into the ward just after 7 o'clock that Sunday evening, clutching a Sainsbury's carrier bag. "How come you knew I was here?" "I'm a detective, sir, remember?" They phoned you, I suppose." "Well," said Lewis briskly, "how are things? What they say's the trouble?" "Trouble? No trouble. It's just a case of mistaken identity." Lewis grinned. "Seriously, though?" "Seriously. Well, they put me on some great big round white pills that cost a couple of quid a time, so the nurses say. Do you realise that you can get a very decent little bottle of claret for that price?" "What about the food? Is it all right?" "Food? What food? Except for the pills, they haven't given me a thing." "Oh, is that what that means?" Lewis jerked his eyes upwards to the fateful warning above the bed. "That's just precautionary," said Morse with unconvincing nonchalance. Lewis's eyes jerked downwards this time towards the carrier bag. "Come on, Lewis, what have you got in there?" Lewis reached inside the bag and brought out a bottle of lemon and barley water. It was just that the missus thought, well, you know, you wouldn't be allowed to drink, to drink anything else much. Very kind of her. You just tell her that the way things are, I'd rather have a bottle of that stuff than a whole crate of whiskey. You don't mean that, sir, do you? It doesn't stop you telling her, does it? "And here's a book," added Lewis, withdrawing one further item from the bag. A book entitled Scales of Injustice, a comparative study of crime and its punishment as recorded in the county of Shropshire, 1842-1852. Morse took the thick volume and surveyed its inordinately lengthy title, though without any obvious enthusiasm. Looks a fairly interesting work." "You don't mean that, do you?" "No," said Morse. "It's a sort of family heirloom, and the missus just thought, well, you tell that wonderful missus of yours that I'm very pleased with it." Lewis was strangely gratified by his chief's reaction, and he smiled to himself. He was still smiling when an extraordinarily pretty young nurse with a freckled face and mahogany-highlighted hair came to Morse's bedside, waved an admonitory finger at him, and showed her white and regular teeth in a dumb show of disapproval as she pointed to the lemon and barley bottle which Morse had placed on his locker top. Morse in turn nodded his full appreciation of the situation and showed his own reasonably regular, if rather off-white, teeth as he mouthed a silent, "Okay." "Who's that?" whispered Lewis when she had passed upon her way. "That, Lewis, is the fair Fiona." "Lovely, don't you think? I sometimes wonder how the doctors manage to keep their dirty hands off her." "Perhaps they don't." "I thought you'd come in here to cheer me up." But for the moment good cheer seemed in short supply. The ward sister had clearly been keeping a dragon's eye on events around the bed where the dehydrated chief inspector lay, to which bed, with purposeful stride, she now took the few steps needed from her vantage point behind the main desk. Her left hand immediately grasped the offending bottle, while her eyes fixed unblinkingly upon the luckless Lewis. We have our regulations in this hospital. A copy of them is posted just outside the ward, so I shall be glad if you follow those regulations and report to me, or whoever's in charge, if you intend to visit again. Your friend here is quite poorly, and we're all trying our very best to see that he gets well again quickly. Now, we cannot do that if you're going to bring in anything you think might do him good, because you'd bring in all the wrong things. She had spoken in a soft Scots accent, this grimly visaged, tight-lipped sister, and Lewis looked wretchedly uncomfortable as she turned away and was gone. "Who's that?" he asked. "You have just had an encounter with the embittered soul of our ward sister." "What's her name?" "Sister McLean. They call her Nessie." "Well, was she born near the lock?" "In it, Lewis." For a further 5 minutes, Lewis quizzed Morse quietly about the other patients, and Morse told him of the dawn departure of the ex-Indian Army man. For another 5 minutes, the two men exchanged words about Police HQ at Kidlington. Then Lewis said, "Well, I'd better be off, sir." "What else have you got in that bag?" "Nothing. Lewis, my stomach may be out of order for the minute, but there's nothing wrong with my bloody ears." When, after prolonged circumspection, Lewis decided that the customs officer was off her guard, he withdrew a small, flattish bottle wrapped in soft, dark blue tissue paper, much the colour of Nessie's uniform. "But not until it's official-like," hissed Lewis, palming the gift surreptitiously into Morse's hand beneath the bedclothes. "Bells?" asked Morse. Lewis nodded. It was a happy moment. As Lewis rose to take his leave, he dipped his hands once more into the carrier bag and produced his final offering, a paperback entitled The Blue Ticket, with a provocative picture of an economically clad nymphette on the cover. I thought you might enjoy something a little bit lighter, sir. I hope your wife never found you reading this kind of rubbish, Lewis." It was only after further testing of pulse and blood pressure, after the administration of further medicaments, that Morse had the opportunity of reading the blurb of the second work of literature, which was now in his possession. Diving into the water, young Steve Mangello had managed to pull the little girl's body onto the yacht. Miraculously, the 6-year-old had survived, and for a few days, Steve was the toast of the boat clubs around the Florida Keys. After his return to New York, he received a letter, and inside the letter a ticket from the young girl's father, the playboy proprietor of the city's most exotic night spot, a club specializing in the wildest sexual fantasies. The book opens as Steve treads diffidently across the thick-carpeted entrance of that erotic wonderland and shows to the topless blonde seated at reception the ticket he has received, a ticket colored deepest blue. Later that evening, Morse dozed off. He was wakened by a gentle pressure on his right wrist. He opened his eyes to find himself staring up into the face of an extraordinary-looking personage. She was a very small woman, of some 75 or 80 summers, wispily white-haired, her face deeply wrinkled and unbeautiful, with an old-fashioned NHS hearing aid plugged into her left ear, its cord stretching down to a battered appliance in the pocket of a dirty, loose, grey woolen cardigan. "Mr. Horse, is it?" Her rheumy eyes squinted myopically at the Elastoplast name tag, and her mouth distended in a dentured smile. "Morse," said Morse. M-O... Do you know, I think they've spelt your name wrong, Mr. Horse. I'll try to remember to tell. Morse. M-O-R-S-E. Yes, but it was expected, you know. They'd already told me that Wilfred had only a few days left to live. And we all do get older, don't we? Yes, Morse thought. Clear off, I'm bloody tired, can't you see? 52 years we'd been together. Morse belatedly realized that this was the widow of the recently departed Colonel Denniston. He nodded sympathetically. "A long time," he said. "He liked being here, you know. He was so grateful to you all." Well, I'm afraid I only came in a couple of days ago. That's why he wanted me to thank you all his old friends here." "He was a fine man," began Morse a little desperately. I wish I'd had the chance to... And that's why I've got this little book for you. He was so proud of it. It took him a very long time, and it was a very happy day for him when it was printed." She handed him a little booklet in bottle green paper covers. "It's very kind of you, because I only came in, and you will promise to read it, won't you?" "Oh, yes, certainly." The old lady smiled with the helplessness of a stranded angel, said, "Goodbye, Mr. Horse," and moved on to the next bed. Morse looked down at the slim volume thus presented. It could contain no more than, some 20-odd pages. He would certainly look at it later, as he'd promised. Tomorrow, perhaps. He placed Murder on the Oxford Canal by Wilfred M. Denniston inside his locker, on top of Scales of Injustice and The Blue Ticket. Tomorrow, yes. Until then, it could play its part in concealing the half-bottle of Bell's whiskey. The endoscopy, performed under a mild anaesthetic at 10 o'clock the following morning, Monday, persuaded the surgeons at the JR2 that in Morse's case the knife was probably not needed. Their prognosis, too, was modestly encouraging, provided the patient could settle into a more cautiously sober and restrictive regimen for the months and years ahead. Furthermore, as a token of their muted optimism, the patient was that very evening to be allowed 1/2 bowl of oxtail soup and a portion of vanilla ice cream. Sergeant Lewis reported to Sister McLean at 7:30 p.m. and was unsmilingly nodded through customs without having to declare one get-well card from Morse's secretary, 1 tube of mint-flavoured toothpaste from Mrs. Lewis, and 1 clean hand towel, same provenance. Contentedly, for 10 minutes or so, the two men talked of this and that, with Lewis receiving the firm impression that his chief was recovering rapidly. When he left, there was virtually no one around in the ward. The Ethiopian athlete was doing the hospital rounds once more, and 2 of the other patients had shuffled their way to the gents. Only a woman of about 30, a slimly attractive, blonde-headed woman, Walter Greenaway's daughter, Morse guessed, and guessed correctly, still sat beside her father. She had given Morse a quick glance as she'd come in, but now hardly appeared to notice him as she made her way out of the ward and pressed the down button in front of the top-floor lifts. The time was 8:40 p.m. Feeling minimally guilty that he had not as yet so much as opened the cover of the precious work that Mrs. Lewis had vouchsafed to his keeping, Morse reached for the book from his locker and skimmed through its first paragraph. Diversity rather than uniformity has almost invariably been seen to characterize the criminal behavior patterns of any technologically developing society. The attempt to resolve any conflicts and or inconsistencies which may arise in the analysis and interpretation of such patterns, see Appendix 3 PPF92FF, is absolutely vital. Christ, muttered Morse. He closed the stout work smartly and resolved to open it never again. As it happened, he was to break this instant resolution very shortly, but for the moment there was a rather more attractive proposition awaiting him in his locker, the pornographic paperback. Morse opened the book. He was immediately aware of a no-nonsense, clear-cut English style that was going to take the palm every time from the sprawling, spawning sociological nonsense he had just encountered. For example, she surfaced from the pool and began to unbutton her clinging, sodden blouse. And as she did so, the young men all fell silent, urging her, praying her, in some unheard but deafening chorus, to strip herself quickly and completely, their eyes now riveted to the carmine tips of her slimly sinuous fingers as they slipped inside her blouse, and so slowly, so tantalizingly flicked open a further button. "Christ," muttered Morse. He replaced the blue ticket in his locker, clasping to himself the prospect of a couple of hours of delicious titillation on the morrow. But for the moment, he felt an irresistible urge to go to sleep. At 2 a.m. the inevitable occurred, but fortunately Morse managed to attract the quick attention of the nurse as she flitted like some nightingale round the darkened wards. The noise of the curtains being drawn round his bed sounded to Morse loud enough to rouse the semi-dead. Yet none of his fellow patients seemed to stir, and she, the blessed girl, had been quite marvellous. "I don't even know which way up the thing should go," confided Morse. "Which way round, you mean?" Eileen, such was her name, had whispered, as she proceeded without the slightest embarrassment to explain exactly how the well-trained patient would negotiate this particular crisis. Then, leaving him with a half-roll of white toilet paper and the firm assurance of a second coming within the next 10 minutes, she was gone. It was all over, consummated with a bowl of warm water and a brief squirt of some odoriferous air freshener. Phew! Not half as bad as Morse had feared, thanks to that ethereal girl, and as he smiled up gratefully at her, he thought there might have been a look in her eyes that transgressed the borders of perfunctory nursing. But Morse would always have thought there was, even if there wasn't, for he was the sort of man for whom some area of fantasy was wholly necessary, and his imagination followed the slender Eileen as elegantly as she walked away, about 5'8" in height, in her mid-20s, eyes greenish hazel, in a delicately featured, high-cheekbone face. No ring of any sort on either hand. Go to sleep, Morse. At 7:30 a.m., after breakfasting on a single wafer of Weetabix, with an inadequate pour-over of semi-skim milk and no sugar, Morse noticed with great satisfaction that the nil-by-mouth embargo was now in abeyance, and he got a glass of water with the joy of a liberated hostage. At 10:50 a.m., a white-coated cohort of consultant commanderlings came to stand round his bed and to consider the progress of its incumbent. The senior man, after briefly looking through Morse's file, eyed the patient. "How are you feeling this morning?" "I think I'll live." "You mentioned here something about your drinking habits," continued the consultant. "Yes?" "You drink a lot." It was a statement. "That's a lot, you think?" The consultant closed the file with a sigh and handed it back to Nessie. "During my long years in the medical profession, Mr. Morse, I have learned that there are two categories of statistics that can invariably be discounted. The sexual prowess of those suffering from diabetes mellitus and the boozing habits of our country's middle management." "I'm not a diabetic." "You will be if you keep drinking a bottle of scotch a week." "Oh, well, perhaps not every week." "You sometimes drink 2 a week, you mean?" When they had passed on, Morse spent 20 minutes with the Times, letters read, crossword completed. Then he folded back the covers of the blue ticket to disguise its nature from the casual observer and started Chapter 1. Good book? So-so. Morse had not been aware of Fiona's presence, and he shrugged non-committally, holding the pages rigidly in his left hand. "What's it called?" The Blue City. A detective story, isn't it?" Morse nodded uneasily. "Sit up." Morse leaned forward as she softened up his pillows with a few left hooks and right crosses and went on her way. Lovely girl, isn't she? It was the stricken Greenaway, now much recovered, and himself reading a book whose title was plain for all to see, The Age of Steam. The blue ticket, that's what it is, Greenaway continued loudly. Pardon? You got the title wrong. It's The Blue Ticket. Did I? Oh, yes, I don't know why I'm bothering to read it, really. Same reason I did, I suppose. Hoping for a bit of sex every few pages. Morse grinned defeatedly. It's a bit of a letdown, went on Greenaway in his embarrassingly stentorian voice. My daughter sometimes brings me one or two books like that. She was the woman last night. W.A. Greenaway nodded. In library work ever since she was 18. 12 years. In the Bodley these last 6. Morse listened patiently to a few well-rehearsed statistics about the mileage of book shelving in the Warrens beneath the Bodleian, and was already learning something of the daughter's curriculum vitae when the monologue was terminated by cleaners pushing the beds around in a somewhat cavalier fashion and slopping their mops into dingily watered buckets. At 7:05 p.m, Morse managed to sort out his headphones for the Archers, and at 7:20 p.m, he decided to dip into the late Colonel Deniston's magnum opus. Murder on the Oxford Canal, he read. Copyright 1978 by Wilfred M. Deniston, OBE, MC. Part 1. In the early 1960s, most of the tombstones which stood in irregular ranks in the Summertown Parish churchyard in North Oxford were removed from their original supracorporal sites in order to afford a rather less melancholic aspect to those who were about to pay their deposits on the flats being built on those highly desirable, if slightly lugubrious, acres. The few headstones which are adequately preserved, and which are to be found even to this day, leaning almost upright against the northern perimeter of the foresaid enclave, are but 1/10 of the memorials once erected there, in the second and third quarters of the 19th century, by relatives and friends, whose earnest wish was to perpetuate the names of those souls, now perhaps known only to God, who passed their terrestrial lives in his faith and fear. One of these headstones, a moss-green limestone slab, standing the farthest away but 3 from the present thoroughfare, bears an epitaph which may still be traced by the practised eye of the patient epigraphist. It reads, "To the memory of Joanna Franks, wife of Charles Franks of London, who, having been primitively and cruelly assaulted, was found most tragically drowned in the Oxford Canal on June the 22nd, 1859, aged 38 years. This stone is erected by some members of Summertown Parish Council. Lord have mercy on her soul." Beyond this poignant epigraph there lies a tale of unbridled lust and drunken lechery, a tale the details of which are the subject matter of our present narrative. Joanna Franks hailed originally from Derby. Her father, Daniel Carrick, had been accredited as an agent to the Nottinghamshire and Midlands Friendly Society, and for a good deal of his married life he appears to have maintained a position as a reasonably prosperous and well-respected figure in his home community. Later, however, and certainly in the few years prior to the tragic death of his only daughter, there was a younger brother, Daniel. He encountered a period of hard times. Joanna's first husband was F.T. Donovan, whose family sprang from County Meath. He is described by one of his contemporaries as an Irishman of many parts, and was known by the nickname of Hefty Donovan. He was a conjurer by profession, or by one of them, and appeared in many theatres and music halls, both in London and in the provinces. To attract badly needed publicity, he, at some unspecified date, assumed the splendidly grandiloquent title of Emperor of all the Illusionists. In 1853, Donovan had written, and found a publisher for, his only legacy to us, a work entitled A Comprehensive Manual of the Conjuring Arts. But the great man's career was beginning to prove progressively unsuccessful, and no stage appearances whatsoever are traceable to 1858. In that year he died, a childless and embittered man, whilst on holiday in Ireland, where his grave now rests in a burial plot overlooking Burtnaboy Bay. Some time afterwards, his widow Joanna met and fell deeply in love with one Charles Franks, an ostler from Liverpool. The new Mrs. Franks was to find employment as a dressmaker and designer's model with a Mrs. Russell of 34 Runcorn Terrace, Liverpool. But Franks himself was less successful in his quest for regular employment, and finally decided to try his luck in London. Here his great expectations were soon realized, for he was almost immediately engaged as an ostler at the busy George and Dragon Inn on the Edgware Road, where we find him duly lodged in the spring of 1859. In late May of that same year he all he could afford, and begged her to join him as soon as possible. On the morning of Saturday, June the 11th, 1859, Joanna Franks, carrying 2 small trunks, bade her farewell to Mrs. Russell in Runcorn Terrace, and made her way by barge from Liverpool to Preston Brook, the northern terminus of the Trent and Mersey Canal, which had been opened some 80 years earlier. Here she joined one of Pickford & Co.'s express, or fly boats. A flyboat travelled round the clock, with a double crew working shifts, with horses exchanged at regular intervals along the canals. This boat was departing for Stoke-on-Trent and Fradley Junction, and thence, via the Coventry and Oxford canals, through to London on the main Thames waterway. The fare of 16 shillings and 11 pence was considerably cheaper than the fare on the Liverpool-London railway line, which had been opened some 20 years earlier. Joanna was an extremely petite and attractive figure, wearing an Oxford blue dress with a white kerchief round her neck and a figured silk bonnet with a bright pink ribbon. The clothes may not have been new, but they were not inexpensive, and they gave to Joanna a very tidy appearance indeed. The captain of the narrowboat, Barbara Bray, was a certain Jack Rory Oldfield from Coventry. He was of a blunt, blustery type of address. He was married, though childless, and was aged 42 years. The fellow members of his crew were the 30-year-old Alfred Musson, alias Alfred Brotherton, a tall, gaunt figure, married with 2 young children; Walter Towns, alias Walter Thorold, the 26-year-old illiterate son of a farm labourer from Branbury; and Thomas Wooton, a teenage lad about whom no certain facts have come down to us. The Barbara Bray left Preston Brook at 7:30 p.m. on Saturday the 11th of June. At Fradley Junction, at the southern end of the Mersey Canal, she successfully negotiated her passage through the locks, and at 10 p.m. on Sunday the 19th of June, she slipped quietly into the northern reaches of the Coventry Canal and settled to a course almost due south that would lead down to Oxford. After reading these few pages, Morse found himself making some mental queries about a few minor items, and harbouring some vague unease about 1 or 2 major ones. Being reluctant to disfigure the printed text with a series of marginalia, he wrote a few notes on the back of a daily hospital menu, which had been left, mistakenly, on his locker. The Colonel's style was somewhat on the pretentious side, a bit too high-flown for Morse's taste. Thinking of writing, and writing books, old Donovan, Joanna's first husband, must have been pretty competent. After all, he'd found a publisher for his great work, and until the last few years of his life, this literate Irish conjurer was seemingly pulling in the crowds at all points between Croydon and Burton-on-Trent. He must certainly have had something about him, this man of many parts. Burton Bay. Morse wrote on the menu. His knowledge of geography was minimal. After winning a scholarship to the local grammar school, the choice of the 3 Gs had been thrust upon him: Greek, German, or geography. Little real choice, though, for he had been thrust willy-nilly into the Greek set, where the paradigms of nouns and verbs precluded any knowledge of the Irish counties. What was the name? Burton Bay. It was paradoxical, perhaps, that Morse should suddenly have found himself so fascinated by the Oxford Canal. He was aware that many people were besotted with boat life, but in Morse's extremely limited experience, narrowboating figured as a grossly overrated activity. Once he had agreed to be piloted from the terminus of the Oxford Canal at Hythe Bridge Street up to the Plough at Wolvercote, a journey of only a couple of miles. The journey had been so fraught with misfortunes that the finishing line was finally reached with only 5 minutes drinking time remaining, and that on a hot and thirsty Sunday afternoon. That particular boat had required a couple of people, one to steer the thing, and one to keep hopping out for locks and what the handbook called attractive little drawbridges. Now, Joanna's boat had got 4 of them on it, 5 with her, so it must surely have been awfully crowded on that long and tedious journey, pulled slowly along by some unenthusiastic horse. Too long. Far quicker by rail, of course, and the fare she paid, 16 shillings and 11 pence, seemed on the face of it somewhat on the steep side for a trip as a passenger on a working boat. In 1859? Surely so. What would the rail fare have been then? Morse had no idea. Boats in the 19th century had been crewed by assortments of men from all over the place. They carried their cargoes of coal, salt, china, agricultural produce, other things. What other things? And why on earth all those aliases? Were the crewmen counted a load of crooks before they ever came to court? Did everyone on the canal have 2 names, a by-name, as it were, as well as one written in the christening book? Surely any jury was bound to feel a fraction of prejudice against such, well, even before. He was feeling tired, and already his head had jerked up twice after edging by degrees towards his chest. The following morning, Wednesday, was busy and blessed, and when at 10 a.m. Fiona had come to remove the saline drip permanently, Morse knew that the gods were smiling. When further, he walked down the corridor to the washroom without encumbrance and without attendant, he felt like Florestan newly released from confinement in Actua Fidelio. And when, with full movement of both arms, he freely soaped his hands and face and examined the rather sorry job he'd earlier made of shaving, he felt a wonderfully happy man. Back in the ward, the time passed, one could say, satisfactorily. A cup of Bovril at 10:30 a.m. was followed by a further recital from Mr. Greenaway of his daughter's quite exceptional qualities, a woman without whom it appeared the Bodleian would have considerable difficulty in discharging any of its academic functions, after which Morse turned to Murder on the Oxford Canal, Part 2. Although at the time, he read, there were few conflicting statements about individual circumstances in the following sequence of events, the general pattern as presented here is undisputed. The 38-odd-mile stretch of the Coventry Canal appears to have been negotiated without any untoward incident. Stops at the 3 Tons Inn at Paisley, and again at the Atherstone Locks further south. The Barbara Bray reached Hawkesbury Junction at the northern end of the Oxford Canal an hour or so before midnight on Monday the 20th of June. The distance from Hawkesbury Junction down to Oxford is 77 miles. The double crew of the flyboat Barbara Bray should have managed the journey within about 36 hours, and this appears to have been the case. What now follows is a reconstruction of those crucial hours based both upon the evidence given at the subsequent trials, for there were 2 of them, and upon later research, undertaken by the present author and others into the records of the Oxford Canal Company registers and the Pickford & Co. archives. One saddening fact stands out, quite stark and incontrovertible. The body of Joanna Franks was found just after 5:30 a.m. on Wednesday the 22nd of June in the Oxford Canal, in the triangular-shaped basin of water known as Duke's Cut, a short passage through to the River Thames dug by the 4th Duke of Marlborough in 1796, about 2.5 miles north of the then canal terminus at Hayfield Wharf in the city of Oxford. For a moment, however, let us make a jump forward in time. After a coroner's inquest at the Running Horses Inn, now demolished but formerly standing on the corner of Upper Fisher Row by Hythe Bridge in Oxford, the 4 crew members of the Barbara Bray were strictly charged with the murder of Joanna Franks and were duly committed to the nearby Oxford jail. In the preliminary trial, held at the Oxford Summer Assizes of August 1859, there were 3 indictments against these men: the wilful murder of Joanna Franks by throwing her into the canal, rape upon the said woman, with different counts charging different prisoners with being principals in the commission of the offence, and the others as aiders and abettors, and the stealing of various articles, the property of her husband. To a man, the crew pleaded not guilty to all charges. Wooten, the boy, who was originally charged with them, was not named in the final indictments. Mr. Sergeant Williams, for the prosecution, said he would first proceed on the rape charge. However, after the completion of his case, the judge, Mr. Justice Traherne, decided that there could be no certain proof of the prisoners having committed the crime, and the jury was therefore directed to return a verdict of not guilty on that charge. Mr. Sergeant Williams then applied to the court for a postponement of the trial under the indictment for murder until the next assizes, on the grounds that a material witness, one Joseph Jarnell, formerly a fellow prisoner of the accused in Oxford jail, could not be heard before the court until he had obtained a free pardon from the Secretary of State with regard to the crime for which he had been imprisoned. Oldfield, the Barbara Bray's captain, was understood to have made some most important disclosures to Jarnell while the 2 men shared the same prison cell. Mr. Justice Traherne consented to the suggested postponement. The judge appointed for the second trial, held in April 1860, was Mr. Augustus Benham. There was intense public feeling locally, and the streets leading to the assize court in Oxford were lined with hostile crowds. The 3 prisoners appeared at the bar wearing the leather belts and sleeve waistcoats usually worn at that time by the canal boatmen, and were duly charged with wilful murder by casting, pushing, and throwing the said Joanna Franks into the Oxford Canal, by which means she was choked, suffocated, and drowned. What exactly, we must ask, had taken place on those last few fatal miles above the stretch of water known as Duke's Cut on the Oxford Canal? The tragic story soon began to unfold itself. There are more than adequate grounds for believing that the journey from Preston Brook down to the top of Oxford Canal at Hawkesbury was comparatively uneventful, although it soon became known that the captain, Oldfield, had sat with Joanna in the cabin while the boat was negotiated through the Northwich and Harecastle tunnels. However, from the time the Barbara Bray reached the lonely locks of Knapton Junction, 30-odd miles down from Hawkesbury, and with Oxford still some 50 miles distant, the story appears to change dramatically. At this juncture, I beg leave to point out that many of the facts in this account are taken from the court registers of the Oxford Assizes 1860, and from the verbatim transcript of those parts of the trial that were reported in Jackson's Oxford Journal, April 1860, passim. William Stevens, a canal clerk employed by Pickford & Co., confirmed that the Barbara Bray reached the Knapton Locks at about 11 a.m. on Tuesday, the 21st of June, and that the boat remained there in all for about an hour and a half. There was a woman passenger on board, and she complained immediately to Stevens about the conduct of the men with whom she was driven to associate. He had advised the woman to report to the company office in Oxford, where it should be possible for her to switch to another boat for the last leg of her journey. Stevens had witnessed some shouted altercations between Joanna and a member of the crew, and remembered hearing Joanna speak the words, "Leave me alone, I'll have nothing to do with you." Two of the men, Oldfield and Musson, he thought, had used some utterly disgraceful language. What seemed quite obvious to Stevens was that the crew were very much the worse for drink, and he gave it as his opinion that they were making very free with the spirit which was their cargo. Before setting off, the woman had complained yet again about the behaviour of the men, and Stevens had repeated his advice to her to reconsider her position once the boat reached the terminus of the Oxford Canal, where a partial offloading of the cargo was scheduled. At Banbury, some 12 miles further down the canal, Joanna made a determined effort to seek alternative transport for the remainder of her journey. Matthew Lawrenson, wharfinger at Tooley's Yard, remembered most clearly Joanna's urgent inquiries about the times of immediate coaches to London and coaches from Oxford to Banbury. But nothing was convenient, and again Joanna was advised to wait until she got to Oxford, now only some 20 miles away. Lawrenson put the time of this meeting as approximately 6:37 p.m. As it happened, Joanna was now to have a fellow passenger, at least for a brief period, since Agnes Lawrenson, the wharfinger's wife, herself travelled south on the Barbara Bray down to King's Sutton Lock, 5 miles distant. Recalling that there was a fellow passenger aboard who looked very agitated, Mrs. Lawrenson stated that Joanna seemed completely sober, unlike Oldfield and Musson, and that she was clearly most concerned about her own personal safety. It was the landlord of the Crown and Castle at Aynhoe, just below Banbury, who was able to provide some of the most telling and damning testimony of all. When Mrs. Lawrenson had left the boat 3 miles upstream at King's Sutton, Joanna could trust herself with the drunken boatman no longer, according to the landlord, who had encountered her at about 10 p.m. that night. She had arrived on foot, and confessed that she was so frightened of the lecherous drunkards on the Barbara Bray that she determined to walk along the towpath even at that late hour. She hoped, she said, that it would be safely possible for her to rejoin the boat later, when the crew might be a few degrees the more sober. While she waited for the boat to come up, the landlord offered her a glass of stout, but Joanna declined. He had kept an eye on her, however, and noticed that as she sat by the edge of the canal, she appeared to be sharpening a knife on the side of the lock. Musson was later found to have a cut on his left cheek, and this could have been, and probably was, made with the same knife. As the boat had drawn alongside Aynhoe Wharf, one of the crew, the landlord was unable to say which, had cursed the eyes of the woman and wished her in hell flames, for he loathed and detested the very sight of her. As she finally reboarded the boat, the landlord remembered seeing Joanna being offered a drink, and in fact he thought she might have taken a glass. But this evidence must be discounted wholly, since Mr. Bartholomew Samuels, the Oxford surgeon who conducted an immediate post-mortem, found no evidence whatsoever of any alcohol in poor Joanna's body. George Bloxon, the captain of a northward-bound Pickford boat, testified that he had drawn alongside Oldfield's boat just below Aynhoe, and that a few exchanges had been made, as normal, between the two crews. Oldfield had referred to his woman passenger in terms which were completely disgusting, vowing in the crudest language what he would do with her that very night, or else he would burke her. Author's note: Burke was a criminal who had been executed some 30 years earlier for smothering his victims and then selling their bodies for medical dissection. George Bloxham added that Oldfield was very drunk, and Musson and Towns, too, were rather well away, the pair of them. James Robson, keeper of the Somerton Deep Lock, said that he and his wife Anna were awakened at about midnight by a scream of terror coming from the direction of the lock. When they looked down from the bedroom window of the lockhouse, they saw some men by the side of the boat, and a woman seated on top of the cabin with her legs hanging down over the side. Three things the Robsons were able to recall from that grim night. Joanna had called out in a terrified voice, "I'll not go down, don't attempt me." Then one of the crew had shouted, "Mind her legs, mind her legs!" And after that the passenger had resumed her frightened screams, including, "What have they done with my shoes? Oh, please tell me!" Anna Robson inquired who the woman was, and was told by one of the crew, "A passenger, don't worry." He explained that she was having words with her husband, who was also on board. At this point, or shortly after, it appears that the terrified woman took another walk along the towpath to escape the drunken crew, but she was almost certainly back on board when the boat negotiated Gibraltar Lock. After which, and only some very short time after, she must have been out walking yet again, since Robert Bond, a crew hand from the narrowboat Isis, recorded his surprise that such an attractive woman should be out walking on her own so late, and he recalled asking her if all was well. But she had only nodded, hurriedly, and passed on into the night. As he approached Gibraltar Lock, Bond had met Oldfield's boat, and was asked by one of the crew if he had seen a woman walking the towpath, the man adding in the crudest terms what he would do to her once he had her in his clutches once again. As with part one, Morse found himself making a few notes, mentally this time, as he read through the unhappy narrative. For some reason he felt vaguely dissatisfied with himself. Something was nagging at his brain about part one, but for the present he was unable to put a finger on it. It would come back to him once he'd reread a few pages. No hurry, was there? And yet the doubts persisted in his brain. If sex was at the bottom of things, why were the rape charges dropped to the first trial? Agreed there was no DNA biological fingerprinting in the 1850s, but even in that era, the charge of rape could often be made to stick without much difficulty, and Confucius's old pleasantry about the comparative immobility of a man with his trousers round his ankles must have sounded just as hollow then as now. This Lawrenson woman, with her husband's full consent, one must assume, had joined the Barbara Brave for the journey down to King Sutton with, as the reader was led to believe, a boatload of sexually rampant dipsomaniacs. Difficult to swallow. Unless, of course, the wharfinger, Lawrenson, was perfectly happy to get rid of his missus for the night, or for any night, whatever the company she might be keeping. Shoes. What was all that about those shoes? There would surely have been more intimate items of Joanna's wardrobe to pilfer, if the crewmen had been seeking to effect some easier sexual congress. One of them might perhaps have been a clandestine foot fetishist. And then there were those journeys through the two tunnels, when Oldfield had sat with Joanna, or when, as Morse translated things, he put his arms round the girl in the eerie darkness and told her not to be afraid. And those last complex, confusing paragraphs. She'd been desperately anxious to get off the boat and away from her tipsy persecutors. But why has she always been so anxious to get back on again? Airy-fairy speculation, all this. But there were at least two things that could be factually checked. He could soon discover how much an alternative route to London would have cost. What, for example, was the rail fare to London in 1859? Interesting. As, come to think of it, were those double quotation marks in the text, presumably the actual words directly transcribed and reported verbatim, and therefore primary source material for the crewman's trial. Morse looked through the interspersed quotations again, and one in particular caused his mind to linger. Coaches to London and coaches from Oxford to Banbury. Now, if those were the exact words Joanna had used, if they were, why had she asked for the times of coaches from Oxford to Banbury? Surely she should have been asking about coaches from Banbury to Oxford. Unless... What finally was he to make of that drink business? Had Joanna been drinking or had she not? There was some curious ambivalence in the text, but Mr. Bartholomew Samuels had found no alcohol in Joanna's body, and that was that. Or rather would have been to most men. The thought of drink had begun to concentrate Morse's mind powerfully, and with great self-care he poured a finger of scotch into his bedside glass with the same amount of plain water. After a few minutes his mind was flooding with ideas, exciting ideas, and furthermore he realized that he could begin to test one or two of his hypotheses that very evening. That is, if Walter Greenaway's daughter came to visit. As she walked down Broad Street at 7:40 a.m. the following morning, Thursday, Christine Greenaway was thinking, still thinking, about the man who had spoken to her the previous evening in Ward 7C on the top floor of the JR2. All because he'd asked her, so nicely, to look up something for him in the Bodley. So earnest, so grateful he'd seemed. And that was silly, really, because she'd willingly have helped him anyway. That's why she'd become a librarian in the first place, and over these last years she had felt a sense of importance and enjoyment in her job, of functioning happily in the workings of the university. Of course, there'd been some major disappointments in her life, as there had been, she knew, with most folk. Married at 22, she'd been a divorcee at 23. If ever she did look for another husband, he would have to be someone she could in some way come to respect. To respect for his conversation, or his experience, or his intellect, or his knowledge, or his... well, his anything at all, really, except a pride in his sexual prowess. So what, she asked herself, had all that got to do with him? Not much to look at, was he? Balding, and quite certainly carrying considerable excess weight around the midriff. She walked down the Broad, past Balliol and Trinity on her left, before crossing over the road just before Blackwell's, and proceeding sub imperatoribus up the semicircular steps into the gravel courtyard of the Sheldonian. Thence, keeping to her right, she walked past the Silence Please notice under the archway, and came out at last into real home territory, the quadrangle of the schools, and into the Bodleian Library through the great single doorway in the west side, beneath the 4 tiers of blind arches in their gloriously mellowed stone. She hung her coat in the librarian's cloakroom and started her daily duties. It was always tedious, that first hour, 7:45 to 8:45, clearing up the books left on the tables from the previous day. She thought back to the brief passages of conversation the previous evening, when he'd nodded over to her, only some 6 feet away. "You work at the Bodleian, I hear." "Uh-huh. It may be... it is a bit of a cheek, not knowing you. But you'd like me to look up something for you? Morse had nodded with a winsome smile. She'd known he was some sort of policeman. Things like that always got round the wards pretty quickly. His eyes had held hers for a few seconds, but she'd been conscious neither of their blueness nor of their authority, only of their melancholy and their vulnerability. Silly twerp you are, she told herself. He'd been rather vague, and it had been somewhat difficult precisely to assess what he wanted. Some specific details about any assurance or insurance companies in the mid-19th century, especially if it were possible about companies in the Midlands. Off and on during the morning, it had taken her an hour or more to hunt down the appropriate catalogues, and another hour to locate the pertinent literature. But by lunchtime, praise be, she had completed her research, experiencing, as she assumed, an elation similar to that of the scholars who daily dug into the treasury of her great library to extract their small nuggets of gold. After carefully photocopying her finds, she wished the PM hours away, for she was impatient to parade the fruits of her research, and she just simply, well, she just wanted to see the man again. That was all. At 6:30 p.m. at her home in the village of Bletchington, some few miles out of Oxford towards Otmore, she slowly stroked red polish onto her smoothly manicured oval nails, and at 7 p.m. started out for the JR2. Equally from his own vantage point, Morse was looking forward to seeing Christine Greenaway once again. The previous evening he'd quickly appreciated her professionalism as she'd listened to his request, as she'd calculated how he might be implemented. In a more personal way he'd noted, too, the candour and intelligence of her eyes almost as blue as his own, and the quiet determination around her small mouth. So it was that at 7:25 p.m. he was sitting in his neatly remade bed, newly washed, erect against his pillows, his thinning hair so recently recombed. Whereupon a succession of disappointments was sent to try him. First, Mrs. Green, his charlady, arrived with a wilting collection of white chrysanthemums and commandeered the sole chair beside his bed. On several occasions from her father's bedside, Christine Greenaway half-turned in the course of her filial obligations. 2 or 3 times her eyes locked with Morse's, hers with the half-amused smile of understanding, his with all the impotence of a stranded whale. Just as Mrs. Green was finally persuaded to leave, a white-coated consultant decided to give 10 minutes of his time to Greenaway Senior, and then to confide his prognosis to Greenaway Junior. Then Lewis came. Never had Morse been less pleased to see his sergeant, but there was no way that he could dislodge him until his visit had run its full and predictable course. On leaving, he presented Morse with a large bunch of white seedless grapes, and at the moment when he left, the bell rang for the end of visiting time. On her way out, Christine came across to Morse's bed and handed him 6 large photocopied sheets. "I hope this is what you wanted." "I'm ever so grateful. It's, well, it's a pity we didn't have a chance to—" "I understand. I do understand," she said. "And you will let me know if I can do anything else. Look, perhaps if we— come along now, please," the charge nurse's imperious voice as she walked quickly around the beds. "Will you be in tomorrow?" asked Morse quickly. "No, not tomorrow. We've got some librarians coming from California." "Come along now, please." It was at 9:20 p.m. that Morse settled back against his piled pillows to glance quickly through the photocopied material Christine had found for him. In the foreword to the Insurance Guide and Handbook 1860, bless the girl, she'd even got the exact year, the anonymous author stated his determination to soldier along in this vale of tears for as long as decently possible. Thus it is that all our efforts are forever required, not to surpass what we may call the biblical par for life, that famous 80 years and 10, but to come reasonably near to attaining it at all. For it is only by continuous vigilance and energy in the work for self-preservation that the appointed average can be brought into view, and with God's grace achieved. When that same author went on to assert that mortality had decreased by 2/5 between 1720, Morse began to wonder what on earth such a bafflingly unscientific, indeed quite nonsensical statement might mean. What did seem immediately clear, as he read through the small print, was that people during those years were beginning to live rather longer, and that by the middle of the 19th century, insurance companies were beginning to match this sociological phenomenon with increasingly attractive rates and premiums, in spite of the sombre statistics appended to each year, right up to the 1850s, like 1853, e.g., the figures for which Morse now considered. Of the 500,000 or so departed souls reported in the pages of the guide, 55,000 had died of consumption, 25,000 of pneumonia, 24,500 of convulsions, 23,000 of bronchitis, 20,000 of... Well, as he lay back on the pillows and thought of the circumstances besetting the luckless Joanna Franks, who had died neither of consumption nor pneumonia, nor... Well, he suddenly fell into a sleep so deep that he missed his 10 p.m. Horlicks and his treasured digestive biscuit. When he was woken rather, the following morning, he felt wonderfully refreshed. With breakfast, temperature, wash, shave, blood pressure, newspaper, tablets, Bovril, all these now behind him, and not a visitor in sight, he settled down to read Part 3 of Murder on the Oxford Canal. Joanna Frank's body, he read, was found at Duke's Cut at about 5:30 a.m. on Wednesday, the 22nd of June, 1859. Philip Tomes, a boatman, said he was passing down canal towards Oxford when he saw something in the water, something which was soon identified as, in part, a woman's gown. What else, though, he could not for the moment make out in the darkened waters. The object was on the side of the canal opposite the towpath, and in due course he discovered it to be the body of a female, without either bonnet or shoes. There was no observable movement about her. She was lying on her face. Tomes stopped his boat, and with a boat hook gently pulled the body to the towpath side, where he lifted it out of the water, in which latter task he was assisted by John Ward, a Kidlington fisherman who happened to be passing. Both men noticed that the face appeared to have turned quite black. John Ward arranged for the body to be taken down to the Plough Inn at Wolvercote. It appears from various strands of interweaving evidence that Oldfield and Musson, and by one account Towns himself, left the Barbara Bray at roughly the point where Joanna met her death, and that they were seen standing together on the towpath side of the canal just below Duke's Cut. A man passed by the area at the crucial time, 4 a.m. or just after, and both Oldfield and Musson, with great presence of mind, asked him if he had seen a woman walking beside the canal. The man had replied, as they clearly recalled, with a very definite no, and had made to get further on his way with all speed. Yet the two, or perhaps three crewmen, had asked him the same question again and again, in rather an agitated manner. This man's testimony could have been vital, but he was never traced, in spite of wide-scale inquiries in the area. A man roughly answering his description, one Donald Favant, had signed the register at the Nag's Head in Oxford for either the 20th or the 21st of June. There was some doubt, but this man never came forward. The strong implication must therefore remain, as it did at the time, that the whole story was the clever concoction of desperate men. Jonas Bamsey, wharfinger in the employ of the Oxford Canal authorities at Oxford's Hayfield Wharf, gave evidence at the trial that the Barbara Bray had duly effected its partial unloading, but that Oldfield had not reported the loss of any passenger, which quite certainly should have been the duty of the boat's captain under the authorities' regulations. Instead, according to the scant and inconsistent evidence on this point, the boatmen do appear to have confided in some of their acquaintances in Upper Fisher Row, claiming that their passenger had been out of her mind, that she had committed suicide, and that on at least one occasion they'd been called upon to save her from an attempted drowning on the journey down from Preston Brook. Later that dreadful day, when the crew of the Barbara Bray came to negotiate the lock on the Thames at Iffley, 2 miles downstream from Folly Bridge, Oldfield spoke to the keeper, Albert Lee, and reported to him and his wife, coincidentally also named Joanna, that a passenger on his boat had been drowned, and that she was most sadly deranged, and had been a sore trial to him and his fellow crew members ever since she'd first embarked at Preston Brook. Oldfield was still obviously very drunk. Pressed to explain what he was seeking to say, Oldfield asserted only that it was a very bad job that had happened. The passenger was off her head, and had been last seen by the crew off Gibraltar Lock. Yet Oldfield was vehemently unwilling to listen to Lee's suggestion of returning to Oxford to sort out the whole tragedy, and this made Lee more than somewhat suspicious. On the departure of the Barbara Bray, therefore, he himself immediately set out for Oxford, where he contacted the Pickford office, and where the Pickford office, in turn, contacted the police authority. When the infamous boat finally arrived at Reading, Constable Harrison was on hand, with appropriate support, to take the entire crew into custody, and to testify that all of them, including the youth, were drunk and excessively abusive as he put them in derbies and escorted them to temporary cell accommodation in the jail at Reading. Hannah McNeil, a serving woman at the Plough in Wolvercote, testified that when the sodden body had been brought from the canal, she had been employed under direction to take off Joanna's clothes. The left sleeve was torn out of its gathers, and the cuff on the same sleeve was also torn. Tomes and Ward, for their part, were quite firm in their evidence that they themselves had made no rips nor tears in Joanna's clothing, as they lifted her carefully from the water at Duke's Cut. Catherine Madison testified that she was a co-helper with Hannah McNeil in taking off Joanna's drenched garments. Particularly had she noticed the state of Joanna's calico knickers, which had been ripped right across the front. This garment was produced in court. Mr. Samuels, the Oxford surgeon who examined the body at the inquest, reported signs of bruising below the elbow of the left arm, and indications of subcutaneous bruising below left and right cheekbones. The same man described the dead woman's face as presenting a state of discoloration and disfigurement. The youth Wooten then gave his version of the tragic events, and on one point he expressed himself forcefully, that Towns had got himself good and half seas over the night before Joanna was found, and that he was sound asleep at the time the murder must have occurred, for he, Wooten, had heard him snoring loudly. We shall never be in a position to know whether Towns had forced Wooten to give this evidence to the court, under some threat or other, perhaps. Joseph Jarnell, the co-prisoner pending whose evidence the retrial had been agreed, related to the court the damning confessions Oldfield had portrayed whilst the two men shared a prison cell. In essence, such amounted to a rather crude attempt on Oldfield's part to settle the majority of blame for almost everything that happened on Musson and Towns. Jarnell's story carried interest, if not conviction. Among the strongest of the fabrications which Oldfield had sought to put about was that Joanna Franks had in excess of 50 golden sovereigns in one of her 2 boxes, that Towns had discovered this fact, and that Joanna had found him rummaging through her trunks. She had threatened, so the allegation ran, to report him to the next Pickford office if he did not mend his ways and make immediate apology and restoration. Such nonsense was wholly discredited at the time, and in the author's opinion may be safely discounted now. The knife which Joanna had been observed sharpening was later found in one of her trunks, the cord of which had been cut and which still remained untied.
The assumption was that at some point the men had opened Joanna's belongings after the murder and had placed the knife in one of the trunks. It must certainly be considered a strong possibility that the men intended to steal some of her possessions, for as we have seen, a charge of theft was included in the most strongly worded terms in the original indictment of the crew at the first trial in August 1859. It seems, however, that prosecuting counsel at the second trial was sufficiently confident to forego such a charge and to concentrate their accusations on murder, since the lesser charge, difficult in any case as it would have been to substantiate, was subsequently excluded. We have seen a similar procedure operating in the first trial concerning the charges of rape. Of all the evidence given at that memorable second trial at Oxford in April 1860, fairly certainly that of Charles Franks himself evoked the greatest feeling and the widest sympathy. The poor man was weeping aloud as he entered the witness box, and it seemed as if it were almost beyond his physical powers to bear the sight of the prisoners and to look upon their faces. He had obviously been deeply in love with Joanna. Turning his back on the vile men arraigned before the court, he explained how, in consequence of some information, he had come into Oxfordshire and seen his wife's dead body at the time of the inquest. For although it was dreadfully disfigured, here the poor fellow could not at all restrain his feelings, yet he knew it by a small mark behind his wife's left ear, a mark which only a parent or an intimate lover could have known. Corroboration of identification, if in fact corroboration was needed, was afforded by the shoes later found in the fore-cabin of the Barbara Bray, which matched in the minutest degrees the contours of the dead woman's feet. At the conclusion of the hearing, and after a lengthy summing up by Mr. Augustus Benham, the jury, under their duly appointed foreman, begged permission of his lordship to retire and consider their verdict. Morse knew that something had at last prodded him into a more intelligent appraisal of the Colonel's story, because he was now beginning to take account of 2 or 3 major considerations which had been staring at him all the while. The first of these was the character of Joanna Franks herself. How would it come about, whatever the fortuitous, involuntary, or deliberate circumstances in which Joanna met her death, that the crew of the Barbara Bray insisted, time and time again, that the wretched woman had been nothing but one long, sorry trial to them all, ever since she had first jumped on board at Preston Brook? How was it that they were still damning and blasting the poor woman's soul to eternity, way after they had pushed her into the canal, and for all Morse or anyone else knew, held her head under the black waters until she writhed in agony against their murderous hands no longer? Had a satisfactory explanation been forthcoming for such an attitude? All right, there was still part 4 of the story to come, but so far the answer was no. There was thought, as it now occurred to Morse, one possible dimension to the case that the good Colonel had never even hinted at, either through an excessive sense of propriety or from a lack of imagination, namely that Joanna Franks had been a seductive tease, a woman who, over those long hours of that long journey, had begun to drive the crew towards varied degrees of insanity with her provocative overtures, and to foster the inevitable jealousies arising therefrom. Come off it, Morse. Yes, come off it. There was no evidence to support such a view. None. Yet the thought stayed with him, reluctant to leave. There was a second general consideration which, from the point of view of criminal justice, struck Morse as considerably more cogent and a good deal less contentious. In the courtroom itself, the odds did seem, surely, to have been stacked pretty heavily against the crew of the Barbara Bray, with presumption of innocence playing decidedly second fiddle to assumption of guilt. Even the fair-minded Colonel had let his prejudgments run away with him a little, Already he decided that any ostensible concern on the part of the boatman for the missing passenger, believed drowned, was only shown with great presence of mind in order to establish a semi-convincing alibi for themselves. Already he had decided that the same boatman, still obviously very drunk, and by implication still knocking it back at top tipplers' rates, had manoeuvred their infamous craft down the Thames to Reading without having the common decency to mention to anyone the little matter of the murder they committed on the way. Did, Morse asked himself, wicked men tend to get more drunk, or more sober, after committing such callous crimes? Interesting thought. Yes, and there was a third general point, one that seemed to Morse most curious. The charges both of theft and of rape had for some reason been dropped against the boatman. Was this because the prosecution had been wholly confident and decided to go for the graver charge of murder, with the expectation, fully justified, that they had sufficient evidence to convict Rory Oldfield and Co. on the capital indictment? Or was it just possible that these charges were dropped because there was no convincing evidence to support them? And if so, was the indictment for murder entered upon by the prosecution for one simple reason, that it presented the only hope of bringing those miserable men to justice? Certainly, as far as multiple rape was concerned, the evidence must have been decidedly dodgy, as the judge in the first trial had pronounced. But what about theft? The prerequisite of theft was that the aggrieved party possessed something worth the stealing. So what was it that poor Joanna had about her person, or had in either of her 2 travelling boxes, that was worth the crime? The evidence, after all, pointed to the fact that she hadn't got a couple of pennies to rub together. Her fare for the canal trip had been sent up from her husband in London, and even facing the terrible risks of travelling with a drunken, lecherous crew, certainly after Banbury had been reached, she had not taken, and not been able to take, any alternative means of transport to get to her husband, who was awaiting her in the Edgware Road. So, what had she got worth stealing? There were those shoes, too. Did Joanna deliberately leave off her shoes? Did she enjoy the feel of the mud between her toes along the towpath, like some barefoot hippie on a watery walk around Stonehenge in the dawn? What a strange case it had been. Morse had a good deal of experience of cases where the forensic and pathological evidence had been vital to the outcome. But he wasn't particularly impressed with the conclusions that presumably must have been drawn from Mr. Samuel's comparatively scientific findings. For Morse, the state of the dress and the bruising described would have been much more consistent with Joanna being held firmly from behind, with the assailant's left hand gripping her left wrist, and his right hand being held forcibly across her mouth, where thumb and forefinger would almost invariably produce the sort of bruising mentioned in the recorded description. What of this Jarnell fellow? The prosecution must have been considerably impressed at the first hearing with his potential testimony. Why otherwise would anyone have been willing to postpone a trial for 6 months on the word of a jailbird? So why was it that, when he duly turned up to tell his tale at the second trial, no one wished to listen to him? Had there been something, some knowledge somewhere, that had caused the court to discount, or at least discredit, the disclosures his cellmate Oldfield had allegedly made to him? The one vital point Jarnell disclosed was that Oldfield had not only protested his own innocence of the murder, but had also sought to shift all responsibility onto his fellow crewmen. Not, to be sure, a very praiseworthy piece of behaviour. Yet, if Oldfield himself were innocent, where else could he have laid the blame? A little thought struck Morse at this point and lodged itself in the corner of his brain for future reference. And a rather bigger thought struck him simultaneously, that he needed to remember that he was only playing a game with himself, only trying to get through a few days' illness with a happy little problem to amuse himself with, like a tricky, cryptic crossword from the listener. It was just a little worrying, that was all. the way the dice had been loaded all the time against those drunkards who had murdered Joanna Franks. If they had. The thought that the crewman may not have been guilty of Joanna Franks' murder proved to be one of those heady notions that evaporate in the sunrise of reason. For if the crewman had not been responsible, who on earth had? Nevertheless, it seemed to Morse pretty much odds-on that if the case had been heard a century later, there would be no certain conviction. Doubtless, at the time, the jury's verdict had looked safe and satisfactory, especially to the hostile crowds lining the streets and baying for blood. But should the verdict have been reached? True, there was enough circumstantial suspicion to sentence a saint, yet no real direct evidence, was there? No witnesses to murder, no indication of how the murder had been committed, no adequately convincing motive for why. Just a time and a place, and Joanna lying face downwards in Duke's Cut all that while ago. Unless, of course, there were some passages of evidence not reported, either from the first or the second trial. The colonel had clearly been more interested in the lax morals of the boatman than in any substantiation of the evidence, and he could just have admitted the testimony of any corroborative witnesses who might have been called. Perhaps it would be of some interest in this harmless game he was playing to have a quick look through those court registers, if they still existed, or through the relevant copies of Jackson's Oxford Journal, which certainly did exist. And in any case, we hadn't finished the colonel's book yet. He began to read, only to be interrupted by the totally unexpected reappearance of Sergeant Lewis, who explained that the purpose of his unofficial visit, it was 2:15 p.m., was to interview a woman still in intensive care in connection with yet another horrendous crash on the A34. Feeling okay today, sir? All the better for seeing you, Lewis. When some 10 minutes later he walked out, Lewis felt the same degree of delight he invariably experienced when he knew that Morse needed him, even if it were only, as in this case, to do a bit of mundane research. Morse had briefly explained the case, and to try to discover if the court registers of the Oxford Assizes 1859-60 were still available, and if so, to see if any records of the trials were still extant. After Lewis had gone, Morse felt very much in tune with the universe. With Lewis looking into the court registers, a certain highly qualified librarian could very quickly sort out Jackson's Oxford Journal. Not that she was coming in that evening, alas. Patience, Morse. At 3 p.m., he turned once again to the beginning of the fourth and final episode of the late Colonel Denniston's book.
The jury, he read, retired to the clerk of indictment's room. After an absence of 3/4 of an hour, they returned to the court, and their names having been read over, every person appeared to wait with breathless anxiety for their verdict. In reply to the usual questions from Mr. Justice Benham, the foreman replied that the jury was all agreed, and that they were unanimous in finding each of the 3 prisoners at the bar guilty of the murder of Joanna Franks. It is said that no visible alterations marked the countenances of the crew on the verdict, except that Oldfield for the moment became somewhat paler. The black coif, emblematical of death, was placed on the judge's head, and after asking the prisoners if they had anything to say, he passed his sentence in the following awesome terms. Jack Oldfield, Alfred Musson, Walter Towns. After a long and patient hearing of the circumstances in this case, and after due deliberation on the part of the jury, you have each and all of you been found guilty of the most foul crime of murder. The murder of an unoffending and helpless woman who was under your protection and who, there is now no doubt as to believe, was the object of your lust, and thereafter, to prevent detection of your crime, was the object of your cruelty. Look not for pardon in this world. Apply to the God of mercy for that pardon, which he alone can extend to sinners who are penitent for their misdeeds. It remains only for me to pass upon you the terrible and just sentence of the law, that you be taken whence you came, and from thence to the place of execution, and that you, and each of you, be hanged by the neck until you be dead, and that your bodies be afterward buried within the precincts of the prison, and be not accorded the privilege of consecrated ground. And may God have mercy on your souls. After the trial was over and sentence pronounced, the three men still persisted in maintaining their innocence. Indeed, Oldfield's wife, who visited the prison, was so agitated by her husband's protestations that she herself was thrown into a sore fit. It had seemed reasonably clear from various statements, including those of Oldfield and Marsden, that Towns had been somewhat less involved in the happenings on the canal journey than the other two. It was no surprise, therefore, that some members of the legal professions now thought that there was a case for the reconsideration of the sentence upon Towns. So a letter, setting forth their agreed view, was taken to London by a barrister, and a special interview with the Secretary of State was obtained. As a result of such representations, Towns was reprieved at the 11th hour. The good news was broken to him as the three men were receiving for the last time the Holy Sacrament from the prison chaplain. Towns immediately burst into a flood of tears, and taking each of his former associates by the hand, kissed them affectionately, repeating, "God bless you, dear friend. God bless you, dear friend." He was later transported to Australia for life, where he was still alive in 1884, when he was seen and interviewed by one Samuel Carter, like Oldfield and Towns, a citizen of Coventry, who took a lively interest in local history and who wrote of his experiences on his return to England the following year. Samuel Carter's book, Travels and Talks in the Antipodes, was published in 1886 by the Farthingale Press of Nottingham. Oldfield and Marsden were duly hanged in public at Oxford. According to the newspaper reports, as many as 10,000 people were estimated to have witnessed the macabre spectacle. Not a spare square foot of space was to be found when at the appointed hour the execution occurred. First to appear was the prison chaplain, solemnly reading the funeral service of the Church of England. Next came the two culprits, and following them the executioner and the governor, as well as some other senior officers from the prison. The executioner shook hands with both men before the operation of pinioning was begun. When it had been completed, the two men walked with firm step to the platform and ascended the stairs to the drop without requiring assistance. The ropes were adjusted round their necks, and then, as the chaplain intoned his melancholy service, the fatal bolt was drawn, and in a minute or two, after much convulsion, the malefactors were no more. The dislocation of the cervical vertebrae and the rupture of the jugular vein had been, if not an instantaneous, at least an effective procedure. It was later disclosed, though it had not been observable at the time, that Oldfield's last action in life had been to hand over to the chaplain a postcard to be delivered to his young wife, in which to the very end he proclaimed his innocence of the crime for which he now paid the ultimate penalty. Locally produced broadsheets, giving every sensational detail of trial and execution, were very quickly on sale in the streets of Oxford. They were even able to give a full account of the last sermon preached to the men at 6 p.m. on the Sunday before the hangings. The text could hardly have brought the condemned prisoners much spiritual or physical solace. Yet they hearkened not unto me, nor inclined their ear, but hardened their neck. They did worse than their fathers. Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 26. The horror felt by the local population at the murder of Joanna Franks did not end with the punishment of the guilty men. Many, both lay and clerical, thought that something more must be done to seek to improve the morals of the boatmen on the waterways. They were aware, of course, that the majority of boatmen were called upon to work on the Sabbath, and had therefore little or no opportunity of attending divine worship. A letter from the Reverend Robert Chantry, vicar of Summertown Parish, was typical of many, in urging a greater degree of concern amongst the boatmen's employers, and suggesting some period of time free from duties on the Sabbath to allow those having the inclination the opportunity of attending a church service. Strangely enough, such attendance would have been readily possible for the crew members of the Barbara Bray had Oxford been a regular port of call, since a special boatman's chapel had been provided by Henry Ward, a wealthy coal merchant, in 1838, a floating chapel moored off Hythe Bridge, at which services were held on Sunday afternoons and Wednesday evenings. For Joanna Franks, as well as for her sorrowing husband and parents, it was a human tragedy that the sermon preached to the murderers on the Sunday prior to their execution was perhaps the first, as well as the last, they ever heard. But it is all a long time ago now. The floating chapel has long since gone, and no one today can point with any certainty to the shabby plot in the environs of Oxford Jail when notorious criminals and murderers and others of the conjecturally damned were once buried. Morse was reminded of a passage which had once been part of his mental baggage, the words of which now slowly returned to him. From Tess of the d'Urbervilles, where Tess herself seeks to bury her illegitimate infant in a place where the nettles grow, and where all unbaptized infants, notorious drunkards, suicides and others... What was the end of it? Wasn't it... Yes. Others of the conjecturally damned are laid. Well, well. A bit of plagiarism on the Colonel's part. He really should have put quotation marks around that memorable phrase. Cheating, just a little. Really. It was good to learn that Oldfield's wife had stood beside her husband, for better or for worse. How Morse would like to have been able to interview her then and there. The recipient, presumably she had been, of that terrible card addressed to her and handed to the chaplain at the very... She must have found it well nigh impossible to believe that a husband would commit so foul a deed. These days there will be a legion of reporters from the News of the World, the Sunday Mirror and the rest, hounding the life of the poor woman and seeking to prize out of her such vital information as whether he'd snored or been tattooed on either upper or lower limbs, or how frequently they indulged in sexual intercourse, or what had been the usual greeting of the loving husband after coming back from one of his earlier murderous missions. No chance of any interview or talk now, though. Not with any of them. But suddenly it struck Morse that perhaps there was. Samuel Carter's travels and talks in the Antipodes. That might be a most interesting document, surely. And it struck Morse with particular pleasure. It would certainly be somewhere on the shelves of the 3 or 4 great UK libraries, the foremost of which was always going to be the Bodleian. Lewis had already been given his research project, and work was now beginning to pile up for his second researcher in the field, what with Jackson's Oxford Journal and now Carter's book. That Friday evening, Morse was visited by both Sergeant Lewis and Christine Greenaway, the latter suddenly changing her mind in foregoing the cocktail reception for those Californian librarians in Wellington Square. Morse was very happy to introduce them to each other. As usual, when she went into Oxford on a Saturday, Christine Greenaway drove down to the Pear Tree roundabout and caught the Park and Ride bus. The Bodleian had not, to the best of her knowledge, microfilmed the whole of the nation's press from the 19th century, so earlier that morning she had telephoned one of her acquaintances in the reference section of the Westgate Central Library and learned that she could have immediate access to Jackson's Oxford Journal for 1859 and 1860. How long did she want the books for? 1 hour? 2? Christine thought 1 hour would be enough. 10:30 to 11:30 a.m. then. On the second floor of the Central Library in the local history and study area, she was soon seated on an olive green vinyl chair in front of a microfilm reader, an apparatus somewhat resembling the upper half of a British Telecom telephone kiosk, with a vertical surface some 2 feet square facing her, upon which the photograph sheets of the newspaper appeared in columns about 2.5 inches wide. The controls marked focusing image, magnification and light control had all been preset for her by a helpful young library assistant, male, and Christine had only to turn an uncomplicated winding handle with her right hand to skip along through the pages of whatever speed she wished, of Jackson's Oxford Journal. She was relieved to discover that the journal was a weekly, not a daily publication, and very soon she found the appropriate columns relating to the first trial of 1859, and like Morse, she became more and more interested. Indeed, by the time she had finished the research into the second trial of April 1860, she was fascinated. She then persuaded the assistant to produce the bulky old files containing the original material and to help her photocopy those yellowing pages which were of interest. She was just finishing when she became aware of a conversation taking place only 3 or 4 yards behind her at the inquiry's desk. "Yes, I've tried the county hall. No help, I'm afraid." "Then your best bet, I should think, is the city archivist. They've got an office in it." "Well, they sent me here." "Oh." The phone rang and the assistant excused himself to answer it. Christine gathered up her notes, turned off the MFR, and went up to the desk. "We met yesterday evening," she began. Sergeant Lewis smiled at her and said, "Hello." "Sorry we can't help, sir," said the assistant, having finished with a phone call. "But they've got no trace of the archivist's." Lewis nodded. "Well, thanks anyway." Lewis was escorting Christine to the swing doors when the assistant had a final thought. "You could try St. Aldate's police station. I've heard that quite a lot of documents and stuff got housed by the police in the war." When alone in crowded streets, Christine sometimes felt a little apprehensive, but she experienced a pleasing sense of being under protection as she walked back towards Carfax with the burly figure of Sergeant Lewis beside and above her. Great Tom was striking 12 noon. The premises of the City Police HQ in St. Aldate's were being extensively renovated and extended, and the work was still in progress when Sergeant Lewis walked in through the main door. Sergeant Lewis knew Chief Superintendent Bell fairly well from the old days up at Kidlington, and was glad to find him in the station. Yes, of course, Bell would help if he could. In fact, the timing of Lewis's visit might be very opportune, because many corners and crannies had only just been cleared out, and the contents of scores of cupboards and dust-covered cases and crates had recently seen the light of day for the first time within living memory. A whole room had been set aside in which the preserved relics and mementos from the earliest days, certainly from the 1850s onwards, had been unsystematically stacked, awaiting appropriate evaluation. In fact, a WPC was in the room now, Sir Bell thought, doing a bit of elementary cataloguing, and if Lewis wanted to look round... Explaining that this was her lunch break, WPC Wright, a pleasant enough brunette in her mid-20s, continued eating her sandwiches and writing her Christmas cards, waving Lewis to any corner of the room he wished, after he had briefly stated his mission. "Oh, well, it's all yours, Sergeant, or at least I wish it was." Lewis could see what she meant. Morse had given him a copy of the Colonel's work. Several spares had been left in the ward, but for the moment he could see little or no chance of linking anything that occurred in 1860 with the chaotic heaps of boxes, files, bags, crates, and piles of discoloured dog-eared documents that lay around. It was clear that a start had been made on sorting things out, for 50-odd buff-coloured labels with dates written on them were attached to the rather neater agglomeration of material that had been separated from the rest and set out in some semblance of chronological order. But amongst these labels, Lewis looked in vain for 1859 or 1860. Was it worth having a quick look through the rest? It was at 1:45 p.m. that Lewis whistled softly. You found something?" "Do you know anything about this?" asked Lewis. He had lifted from one of the tea chests a chipped and splintered box about 2 feet long by 1 foot wide and about 9 to 10 inches deep. A small box by any reckoning, and one which could be carried by a person with little difficulty, since a brass plate some 4 inches by half an inch set in the middle of the box's top held a beautifully moulded semicircular handle, also of brass. But what had struck Lewis instantly and with wondrous excitement were the initials engraved upon the narrow plate, J.D. Lewis had not read the slim volume with any great care, but he remembered clearly the 2 trunks which Joanna had taken to the boat, and which presumably had been found in the cabin after the crew's arrest. And the name of Joanna's first husband had begun with a D. The policewoman came over and knelt beside the box. The 2 smallish hooks, one on each side of the lid, moved easily, and the lock on for the lid lifted back to reveal, inside the green plush lining, a small canvas bag on which, picked out in faded yellow wool, were the same initials as on the box. Lewis whistled once more, louder. Can we? He could scarcely keep the excitement from his voice, and the policewoman looked at him curiously before gently shaking the bag's contents out onto the floor. A small rusted key, a pocket comb, a packet of needles, 2 flat-heeled, flimsy-looking shoes, and a pair of calico knickers. Lewis shook his head in dumbfounded disbelief. He picked up the shoes gingerly, as if he expected they might disintegrate. Then between thumb and forefinger, the calico knickers. "I think I could borrow these shoes and he asked. W.P.C. Wright eyed him once again with amused curiosity. "Oh, it's all right," added Lewis. "They're not for me." "No?" "Morse. I work for Morse." "I suppose you're going to tell me he's become a knicker fetishist in his old age." "Oh, well, you know him. You'll have to sign for them. Fetch me the book." During that same Saturday, we saw Sergeant Lewis and Christine Greenaway giving up their free time on his behalf. Morse himself was beginning to feel fine again. Exploring new territory, too, since after lunchtime he was told he was now free to wander along the corridors at will. Thus it was that at 2:30 p.m. he found his way to the day room, an area equipped with armchairs, a coloured TV, table skittles, a bookcase, and a great pile of magazines. The top one, Morse noted, a copy of Country Life, dating from 9 years the previous August. The room was deserted, so Morse settled down in an armchair and quietly contemplated the Oxford Canal once more. A quartet of questions, then. First, was it true that a jury should have been satisfied beyond any reasonable doubt that the boatman murdered Joanna Franks? Answer: no. Not one shred of positive evidence had been produced by the prosecution which could be attested in court by any corroborative witnesses to murder, and it had been on the count of murder that the boatman had been convicted. Second, was it true that the prisoners at the bar had been afforded the time-honoured presumption of innocence, the nominal glory of the British legal system? Answer: it certainly was not. Prejudgments had been rife from the start of the first trial. The attitude of the law officers, no less than the general public, had been throughout one of unconcealed contempt for and revulsion against the crude, barely literate, irreligious crew of the Barbara Bray. Third, was it true that the boatmen, or some of them, were likely to have been guilty of something? Answer: most certainly yes. And perversely, most probably guilty of the 2 charges that were dropped, those of rape and theft. Fourth, was there a general sense, even if the evidence was unsatisfactory, even if the jury were unduly prejudiced, in which the verdict was a reasonable one, a safe one, as some of the jurisprudence manuals like to call it? Answer, no. 1,000 times no. Almost now, Morse felt he could put his finger on the major cause of his unease. It was all those conversations, heard and duly reported, between the principal characters in the story. Conversations between the crew and Joanna, between the crew and other boatmen, between the crew and lockkeepers, wharfingers and constables. All of it was wrong somehow. Wrong if they were guilty. It was as if some inexperienced playwright had been given a murder plot and had then proceeded to write page after page of inappropriate, misleading, and occasionally contradictory dialogue. For there were moments when it looked as if it were Joanna Franks who was the avenging fury, with the crewmen merely the victims of her fatal power. And then, too, the behaviour of Oldfield and Musson after the murder seemed to Morse increasingly a matter of considerable surprise. It seemed quite extraordinary that, after, as was claimed, the crew had somehow and for some reason managed to murder Joanna Franks, they were, some 36 hours later, still knocking back the booze, still damning and blasting the woman's soul to eternity. Morse had known many murderers, but never one who had subsequently acted in such a fashion, let alone 4. Not that it mattered, though, well, not really, after all these years. It was time to get back to the ward. As he was leaving, his eyes roamed automatically over the bookcase, and he stopped. There, on the lower row and standing side by side, were the titles Victorian Banbury and Oxford, Rail Centre Series. Having extracted both, he walked on. Walter Algernon Greenaway had been trying, with little success, to get along with the Oxford Times crossword. He had little or no confidence in the skill, but it had always fascinated him, and when the previous day he had watched Morse complete the Times crossword in about 10 minutes, he felt most envious. Morse had just settled back in his bed on his return to the ward when Greenaway, known to his friends as Waggy, called across, You're pretty good at crosswords." "Not bad." "You know anything about cricket?" "Not much. What was the clue?" "Bradman's famous duck." "How many letters?" 6. "Yeah, I saw Bradman at the Oval in 1948. He got a duck then." I shouldn't worry too much about cricket," said Morse. "Just think about Walt Disney." Greenaway licked the point of his pencil and thought unproductively about Walt Disney. "Who's heading the crosswords this week?" asked Morse. Chap called Quixote." Morse smiled. Coincidence, wasn't it? "What was his Christian name?" Have you, sir?" said Waggy, happily entering the letters at one across. Morse couldn't have chosen a more informative couple of books. First, from Victorian Banbury, he gleaned the information that stagecoaches were readily available between Banbury and Oxford, only 20 miles to the south, during the 1850s and 1860s. Furthermore, the author gave full details of the individual stagecoaches that would have been available on the day in question, and about which Joanna Franks must have made inquiry. Quite certainly, coach horses would have been seen galloping southwards on 3 separate occasions in the earlier half of the following day, delivering passengers picked up at the Swan in Banbury to the Angel Inn and the High at Oxford. That for the sum of 2 shillings and 1 penny. Even more interesting for Morse was the situation pertaining at Oxford itself, where Paddington, according to his second work of reference, were far more frequent and far quicker than he could have imagined. And presumably Joanna herself, at Banbury on that fateful day, had been presented with exactly the same information. No less than 10 trains daily, leaving at 2:10 a.m., 7:50 a.m., 9 a.m., 10:45 a.m., 11:45 a.m., 12:55 p.m., 2:45 p.m., 4 p.m., 5:50 p.m., and 8 p.m. Embarras de choix. Admittedly, the fare seemed somewhat steep, with first, second, and third-class carriages priced respectively at 16 shillings, 10 shillings, and 6 shillings for the 60-odd-mile journey. There were also 3 coaches a day, making the journey to London via the Henley and Reading turnpikes, the Blenheim and the Prince of Wales each departing at 10:30 a.m., with arrival an hour later, their fare being a whole shilling less than the third-class railway fare. And where did they finish up in the metropolis? Well, it was quite extraordinary. The Edgware Road. So for a few minutes Morse looked at things from Joanna's point of view. Arriving at Banbury as she had in the latest evening, she would very soon have seen the picture. No chance of anything immediately, but the ready opportunity of a stay overnight in Banbury in one of the taverns along the quayside, costing no more than 2 shillings or so. Then one of the coaches to Oxford next morning, the Book of Words mentioned one at 9:30 a.m., reaching Oxford at about 1 p.m. That would be no difficulty about catching the 2:45 p.m. to Paddington, or one of the 3 later trains. Easy. If she had eventually made a firm decision to escape her tormentors for good, then the situation was straightforward. 2 shillings overnight, say 2 shillings and 1 penny coach fare, 6 shillings third-class railway fare. That meant that for about 10 shillings she was offered a final chance of saving her life, and without much bother, without much expense, she could have done so. But she hadn't. Why not? Received wisdom maintained that she hadn't got a penny piece to her name, let alone half a guinea. But had she nothing she could sell or pawn? Had she no negotiable property with her? Why then, if that was so, could there ever have been the slightest suspicion of theft? Normal shifts for the nursing staff at the JR2 were early, 7:45 to 15:45, late, 1300 to 21:30, and night, 2100 to 8:15. All was more of an owl than a lark. Nurse Eileen Stanton shared none of the common objections that were levelled against the night shift. Born with a temperament slightly tinged with melancholy, she was perhaps a natural creature of the dark. But this particular week had been unusual, and that day, instead of being on night, she was on late. She'd noticed Morse, and he her, as he'd walked along the day room, watched him walk back half an hour later, and spend the rest of the afternoon reading. Bookish sort of fellow, he seemed. Nice, though. And she could go and have a word with him, perhaps once he put his books down, which he didn't. She watched him again at 7:40 p.m. as he sat against the pillows, and more particularly watched the woman who sat beside him in a dark blue dress with glints of gold and auburn in her hair, the regular small-featured face leaning forward slightly as she spoke to him. To Eileen, the pair of them seemed so eager to talk to each other, so different from the conversational drought which descended on so many hospital visitations. She envied them, envied especially the woman, Waggy Greenaway's clever clogs of a daughter. From the few times Eileen had spoke to Morse, she knew that his conversation, and perhaps she thought his life too, was so interesting. She'd met only a few men like that. Christine Greenaway stood up to go, and Morse was suddenly conscious, as she stood so close beside the bed, of how small she was, in spite of the high-heeled shoes she habitually wore. Words came back to his mind, the words he'd read again so recently. Petite and attractive figure, wearing an Oxford blue dress. How tall are you, he asked. In stocking feet, I'm 5 feet, half an inch. I wear heels all the time, so I can come up to about 5'3". What size shoes do you take? 3s. You wouldn't be able to get your feet in them. I've got very nice feet, said Morse seriously. I think I ought to be more worried about my father than about your feet, she whispered quietly as she touched his arm, and Morse in turn placed his own left hand so briefly, so lightly upon hers. And you'll look up that. I won't forget. I just wonder, said Morse almost absently as Sergeant Lewis took Christine's place on the plastic chair. I just wonder what size shoes Joanna Franks took. I'm assuming, of course, that they had shoe sizes in those days. What do you think, Lewis? Would you like me to show you exactly what size she did take, sir? Said Lewis. Morse was invariably credited by his police colleagues with an Alpha Plus intelligence. Whatever the truth of the matter, he himself knew that one gift had never been bestowed on him, that of reading quickly. It was to be observed, therefore, that he seemed to spend a disproportionately long time that evening, Christine gone, Lewis gone, alcoholics drunk, pills swallowed, injections injected, in reading through the photocopied columns of Jackson's Oxford Journal. When as a boy he had been shepherded around various archaeological sites, Morse had been unable to share the passion of some fanatic drooling over a few disintegrated Roman bricks. Even then it had been the written word rather than the tangible artifact which had pricked his curiosity and promoted his subsequent delight in the ancient world. It was to be expected, therefore, that although Lewis's quite extraordinary discovery was to prove the single most dramatic breakthrough in the supposed case, the sight of a sad-looking pair of shriveled shoes and an even sadder-looking pair of crumpled knickers was for Morse a little anticlimactic, at least for the present. Christine's offerings, though, how wonderfully attractive and suggestive they were. From the newspaper records, it was soon clear that the Colonel had omitted no detail of any obvious importance. Yet there were quite a few factors here, to Morse hitherto unknown, which caused him more than a millimetre rise of the eyebrows. First, reading between the lines of the photocopied material, it seemed fairly clear that the charge of theft had probably been dropped at the first trial for the reason that the evidence, such as it was, had pointed predominantly to the youth Wooten, therefore necessitating an individual prosecution, and that against a minor. If any of the other crewmen were involved, the man deported to Australia, who figured as the safest bet. Quite certainly no evidence of theft could be levelled against the two men eventually hanged for murder. What was it then that the youth's covetous eyes may have sought to steal from Joanna Frank's baggage? No answer emerged clearly from the evidence. Second, there was sufficient contemporary evidence to suggest that it was Joanna who was probably the sustaining partner in her second marriage. An extract from a letter from her to Charles Franks had been read out in court. It included the following passage. Sorry I am to read, my dear husband, your sadly wandering letter. Do, my dear, strive against what I fear will await you, should you not rest your tortured mind. The loss of reason is a terrible thing and will blight our hopes. Be strong, and know we will soon be together. Be sure that God will provide. A poignant and eloquent letter. Third, various depositions from both trials made it clear that although flyboats work best with the strict enforcement of a two-on-two-off arrangement, it was quite usual in practice for the four members of such a crew to permutate their different duties in order to accommodate individual likings or requirements, or desires, perhaps. For Morse now read with considerable interest that Oldfield, captain of the Barbara Bray, had paid Walter Towns sixpence to take over from him the arduous business of legging a boat through the Barton Tunnel. Fourth, the evidence, taken as a whole, suggested strongly that for the first half of the journey Joanna had joined in quite happily with the boatmen at the various stops, staying in their company, eating at the same table, drinking with them, laughing with them at their jokes. Few jokes, though, on the latter half of the journey, when, as the prosecution had pressed home again and again, Joanna figured only as a helpless, hapless soul, crying out, at times literally, for help, sympathy, protection, mercy. On one decisive and dramatic fact, as the crew themselves grew progressively more inebriated, Joanna was becoming increasingly sober. For the coroner's evidence, as reported at the trial, was incontestable. No alcohol at all was found in her body. Finally, there was a further passage of evidence which the colonel had not cited. It was apparently Oldfield's claim that at about 4 a.m. on the fateful morning, the boatman had, in fact, caught up with Joanna on the towpath. Joanna in a state of much mental confusion, for he and Musson had discovered her whereabouts only because of the anguished cries she was uttering, calling upon the name of her husband. Franks! 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 Furthermore, Oldfield claimed he had actually persuaded her to get back on the boat, though he agreed that she had fairly soon jumped off again to resume her walking along the towpath. Then, according to Oldfield, two of them, he and Towns on this occasion, had once more gone ashore, where they met another potential witness, the Donald Favant mentioned in the colonel's book. But the boatman had not been believed. In particular, the second meeting along the towpath had come in for withering scorn from the prosecution. At best, the confused recollections of hopelessly drunken minds. At worst, the invention of these callous murderers. "You comfy?" asked Nurse Eileen Stanton, pulling the folds of his sheets tidy. "Oh, I thought you'd gone off duty." "I'm going." "You're spoiling me." You enjoy reading, don't you?" Morse nodded. Sometimes." "You like reading best of all?" "Well, music. Music, I suppose, sometimes more. Reading and music, well, they're the best. Apart from a candlelit evening meal with someone like you." "Oh." Before going to sleep that night, Morse's hand glided into the bedside cabinet and poured out a small measure, and as he sipped the scotch at his own pace, the world of a sudden was none too bad a place. When he was woken rather, the following morning, Sunday, he marvelled at the blindingly obvious notion that now occurred to him had taken such an age to materialize. Usually his cerebral analysis was as swift as the proverbial snap of a lizard's eyelid, or so he told himself. He waited with keen anticipation until his morning ablutions were complete, before rereading the colonel's work. What were the actual words of the trial report? Yes, Morse nodded to himself. When Charles Franks had looked at the body, he had recognized it, dreadfully disfigured as it was, by a small mark behind his wife's left ear, a mark of which only a parent or an intimate lover could have known. By all the gods, was ever identification so tenuously asserted and attested in the English courts? Not only a tiny disfigurement in a place where no one else would have been aware of it, but a tiny disfigurement which existed on the head of Joanna Franks only because it existed in the head of her new husband. Oh, it must have been there, all right. The doctor, the coroner, the inspector of police, those who had undressed the dead woman and redressed her for a proper Christian burial, so many witnesses who could, if need ever arose, corroborate the existence of such a blemish on what had once been such a pretty face. But who could or did corroborate the fact that the face had been Joanna's? The husband? Yes, he'd had his say. But the only others who might have known, the parents, where were they? Apparently they had played no part at all in the boatman's trial at Oxford. Why not? Was the mother alive at the time of the trial? The father was alive, though, wasn't he? The insurance man. No court would have accepted such unilateral identification without something to support it. And there had been something. Again, Morse looked back to the actual words. Corroboration was afforded by the shoes later found in the forecabin of the Barbara Bray, which matched in the minutest degrees the contours of the dead woman's feet. So the matter was clear. 1. The shoes in the cabin belonged to Joanna Franks. 2. The shoes had been worn by the drowned woman. Therefore 3. The drowned woman was Joanna Franks, QED. Even Aristotle might have been satisfied by such a syllogism. But what if the first statement was not true? What if the shoes had not belonged to Joanna? Then the inexorable conclusion must be that whatever was found floating face downwards at Duke's Cut in 1859, it was not the body of Joanna Franks. Just one moment, Morse. The confusion was deafening in his ear. All right. The identification as it stood, as it stands, may perchance appear a trifle tenuous. But have you, any reason for discrediting such identification? And the answering voice in Morse's brain, Morse's voice, was firm and confident. Indeed. And if it should please my learned friends, I shall now proceed to tell you exactly what did happen between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m. on the morning of Wednesday, the 21st of June, 1859. Morse leaned back on his pillows, and his very blue eyes focused on the far distance, somewhere far beyond the wall he was staring at, and he let his imagination have its say. Standing by the door of the forecabin, she could see them both. Asleep, the pair of them, Oldfield and Musson, only the slight rise and fall of the faded maroon eiderdown that covered them both betraying their fitful breathing. Drunk? Yes, very drunk. But Joanna herself had seen to that. Little or no persuasion required, but the timing important. She smiled grimly to herself and consulted the little silver timepiece she always kept so carefully about her person, the watch her father had given her on her 21st birthday. Occasionally she spoke quietly, very quietly, to the shifty, silly, spotty-faced youth who stood beside her at the entrance to the cabin, his left hand upon the Z-shaped tiller painted in alternate bands of red, green, yellow, his right hand where she had placed it herself, fondling the bosom of her dress. 25 yards ahead, the horse was plodding along the silent towpath, with only the occasional flap of the waters to be heard as they slurped against the Barbara Bray. "Over a bit, Tom," she whispered, as the boat moved into the elbow bend at Thrupp. "And don't forget our little bargain," she added as she stepped up onto the side, whilst young Wooten gently manoeuvred the boat ever closer towards the right-hand bank. Wooten would not be celebrating his 15th birthday until the February of 1860, but already, in several ways, he was a good deal older than his years. And not in every way, though. Never, before Joanna had come on board at Preston Brook, had he felt so besotted with a woman as he was with her, exactly as the rest of the crew had been, a fact of which he was well aware. And Oldfield had taken possession of her, and of that Wooten was quite sure. Taken her in one pitch-black transit tunnels when he, Wooten, had gladly taken Oldfield's sixpence and legged the Barbara Bray slowly towards that pinpoint of light which had gradually grown ever larger, as darkly he had listened to the noises of the love-making taking place in the bunk below him. Towns, too, had taken Oldfield's sixpence in a tunnel further south, and both Towns and Musson, the lanky, lecherous-eyed Musson, knew only too well what was going on, soon wanting a share of things for themselves. No surprise, then, that Towns had gone for Musson with a knife. As agreed, Wootton provided her with a lantern. She took it and leapt lightly off the Barbara Bray, her bonnet around her head, her shoes upon her feet, onto the towpath bank where, very soon, she had disappeared. It was not unusual, of course, for women passengers to jump ashore at fairly regular intervals from a narrowboat. Female toiletry demanded a greater measure of decorum than that for men. She stood back in the undergrowth, watching the boat melt into the night. Then, gauging that she was out of earshot of the crew, she called out the man's name, without at first receiving a reply. Then again. Then a third time, until she heard a rustling movement in the bushes beside her, and a suppressed, tense shh. The night air was very still, and her voice had carried far too clearly down the canal, with both the youth at the helm and the man with the stoical horse turning round simultaneously to look into the dark. Hearing nothing further, neither of them gave the matter much further thought. But one of the men supposedly asleep had heard it too. Meanwhile, Joanna and her accomplice had flitted stealthily along the row of small greystone terrace cottages which lined the canal at Thrupp, keeping to the shadows. Then they moved along the short hedge-lined lane that led to the Oxford to Banbury highway. For the Barbara Bray, the next 3 miles of the Oxford Canal would interpose the Roundham, Kidlington Green and Shuttleworth's locks, the latter just north of the basin at the water known as Duke's Cut. Negotiation of these locks, so carefully calculated, would afford appropriate opportunity. No real problem. Much more difficult had been the arrangements for meeting each other, and certainly Oldfield more than once had looked at Joanna suspiciously in the last 24 hours, as she had taken, but of necessity, her diurnal and nocturnal promenades. She knew, though, how to deal with Oldfield, the skipper of the Barbara Bray. "Everything ready?" she asked. He nodded. They walked across to a covered carrier's wagon which stood, a piebald horse between the shafts, tethered to a beech tree just beside the verge. The moon appeared fitfully from behind the slow-moving clouds. "Knife?" he asked. "I sharpened it." She took off her cloak and handed it to him, taking in return the one he passed her, similar to her own, though cheaper in both cloth and cut, and slightly longer. "You didn't forget the handkerchief?" Quickly she rechecked, drawing from the right-hand pocket of her former cloak the small white linen square, trimmed with lace, the initials J.F. worked neatly in pink silk in one corner. She's in there." Joanna half turned to the back of the wagon. He jerked his head once, his small eyes bright in the heavily bearded face. "I don't really want to see her," she said. "No need." He had taken the lantern, and when the two of them had climbed up to the front of the wagon, he shone it on a hand-drawn map, his right forefinger pointing to a bridge over the canal some 400 yards north of Shuttleworth's Lock. "We're going down to here. You wait there and catch up with them, all right? Then get on board again. Then after that, after you get through the lock, what we agreed. Yeah, jump in. You can stay in the water as long as you like, but be sure no one sees you getting out. The wagon will be next to the bridge. You get in and lie still. I'll be there as soon as I've..." Joanna took the knife from her skirt. "Do you want me to do it?" "No." He took the knife quickly. "No? It's just that her face, it's gone black." The man climbed onto the foreboard and helped her up, before disappearing into the darkness of the covered cart, where, holding the lantern well away from the face, he lifted the dead woman's skirts and made an incision of about 5 or 6 inches down the front of her calico. "Some soup for you, Mr. Morse." Morse came back to reality, to find Violet smiling benevolently down at him.
The report was a regular feature of the wards in the jail too, a meeting of hospital and medical staff at the changeover points between early, late and night shifts. The 1 p.m. meeting on the second day of Morse's stay was well attended. The senior consultant, a junior houseman, Sister McLean, Nurse Stanton, and 2 student nurses. Crowded into Sister's small office, the group methodically appraised the patients in the ward, briefly discussing medications, prognosis, convalescences, relapses, and associated problems. Morse, it appeared, was no longer much of a problem. Morse? The hint of a smile could be observed on the consultant's face as he was handed the relevant notes. "Keep him another few days, you think?" Sister McLean queried. "No," decided the consultant after a pause. No, just send him home. His wife will probably do just as good a job as we can. Same medication, outpatients in 2 weeks, to see me, okay?" Eileen Stanton was about to correct the consultant on his error as regards Morse's marital status when a nurse burst into the office. I'm sorry, Sister, but there's a cardiac arrest, I think, in one of the immunity beds." "Did he die?" asked Morse. Eileen, who had come to sit on his bed, nodded sadly. It was mid-afternoon. "How old was he?" I don't know exactly. A few years younger than you, I should think." Her face was glum. "Perhaps if... you look as if you could do with a bit of tender, loving care yourself," said Morse, reading her thoughts. "Yes." She looked at him and then smiled, determined to snap out of her mopishness. "And you, my good sir, are not going to get much more of our tender, loving care after today. We're kicking you out tomorrow. Quite enough of you." "Me? Out?" Morse wasn't sure if it was good news or bad, so she told him. "That's good news, isn't it?" "I shall miss you," he said. Although Mrs. Green had kept Morse's partially central heating partially on, the flat seemed cold and unwelcoming. At 5:30 the phone rang, and Morse knew that if he had one wish only, it would be for the caller to be Christine Greenaway. The caller was Christine Greenaway. Not only had she located the rare and extraordinarily valuable book of which Morse had inquired, but she had spent an hour or so that afternoon reading through the relevant pages and discovering that only one short chapter was given over to the interview between Samuel Carter and an aging Walter Towns concerning the trial of the boatman. "Oh, that's wonderful," said Morse. "Where are you ringing from?" "From home. Perhaps... look," she interrupted, "I've made a photocopy. Would you like me to send it through the post? Or I could... well, could you read it over the phone? It's fairly short, you say." Page 187. It begins. "Ready?" "Ready, miss." Of the persons encountered in Perth in these last months of 1884 was a man called Walter Towns. Although he was known as a local celebrity, I found it difficult to guess the quality which had avowedly brought such renown to the miserable specimen to whom I was introduced. He was a small man, 5 feet in stature, thin, of a gaunt mien, and sallow complexion. His hollow aspect was further enhanced by the complete absence of teeth in the upper jaw, yet his eyes spoke a latent intelligence, and also a certain dolefulness, as if he were remembering things done long ago, and things done ill. In truth, the situation pertaining to this man was fully as my readers could have wished, for he had been reprieved from the gallows with only minutes to spare. It was with the utmost interest and curiosity, therefore, that I questioned him. A woman had been murdered near Oxford in 1860 on the local canal, and suspicion had centred on the crew of a narrowboat plying south towards London. The 4 members of the crew, including both Towns himself and a lad of some 14 years, had duly been arrested and brought to court. Whilst the youth had been acquitted, the 3 others had been convicted and incarcerated in the jail in the city of Oxford, awaiting public execution. It was here, 2 or 3 minutes following the final visit of the chaplain to the prisoners in their condemned cells, that Towns had received the news of his reprieve. Few humans, certainly, can have experienced such a dramatic change of fortune. Towns was a free man. After serving his 15 years' penal servitude in the Long Bay Penitentiary, a man old before his time, he was but 47, a veteran convict or crawler who had experienced the ineffable agonies of execution on the morrow. Of the crime itself, Towns protested his complete innocence, a protestation not without precedent in criminal archives, but his recollection of the canal journey, and especially of the victim herself, Joanna Franks, was vivid and most poignant. The woman had been, in Towns' eyes, quite wondrously attractive, and it may cause no surprise that she became, almost immediately, the object of the men's craving and the cause of open jealousies. Indeed, Towns recalled an occasion when 2 of the crew, the 2 who were eventually hanged, had come to blows over that provocative and desirable woman, and one of them with a knife. Even the young boy, Harold Wooten, had come under her spell, and the woman had without much doubt taken advantage of his infatuation. At the same time, from what Towns asserted, and from the manner of his assertions, I am of the view that he himself did not have sexual dealings with the woman. There is one interesting addendum to be made. In the first indictment, as I have subsequently read, the charge of either rape or theft would possibly have been prosecuted with more success than that of murder, yet it was to be the charge of murder that was brought in the second trial. In similar instances, we may observe that the minor charge will frequently be suppressed when the major charge appears the more likely to be sustained. Was this then the reason why Towns seemed comparatively loquacious about the suggestion of theft? I know not. But it was his belief, as recounted to me, that Wooten had rather more interest in theft than in rape. After all, the availability of sexual dealings in 1860 was hardly, as now, a rarity along the English canals. Well, I mean, that's it. I'll put it in the post tonight, so you should, oh, well, can't you call round and bring it? Life's, well, it's just a bit hectic at the moment, she replied. Morse said nothing. Is your name the same as in the telephone directory? E. Morse. Yes, that's me. That is I, if you prefer it. What does the E stand for? I never knew what to call you. They just call me Morse. You won't forget me? She asked after a little pause. I'll try, I suppose. Morse thought of her for many minutes after he cradled the phone. Then he recalled the testimony of Samuel Carter, and marvelled that the researcher of Carter's undoubted experience and integrity could make so many factual errors in the course of 3 or 4 pages. The date of the murder, Towns' age, Wooten's Christian name. Very interesting, though. Why? Morse had even guessed right about that dust-up with a knife. Well, almost right. He'd got the wrong man, but otherwise... 10 minutes later the phone rang again, and Morse knew in his bones that it was Christine Greenaway. It was Superintendent Strange. "You're out there, Morse, yes? Oh, well, that's good. You've had a bit of a rough ride, you tell me. On the mend now, sir. Kind of you to ring. Well, no great rush, you know. About getting back, I mean. We're a bit understaffed at the moment, but give yourself a few days to get over things. Delicate thing, the stomach, you know. Why don't you try to get away somewhere for a couple of days? Oh, well, thank you, sir. By the way, they have signed me off for a fortnight at the hospital." "Fortnight? A fortnight?" "It's a delicate thing, the stomach, sir." Yes, well, and perhaps it wouldn't do me any harm to take your advice about getting away for a little while?" "Do you the world a good. The wife's brother," Morse groaned inwardly. "He's just back from a wonderful holiday. Southern Ireland, took the car, Fishguard to Dunlair, then the West Coast, you know, Cork, Kerry, Killarney, Connemara. Marvellous, he said. It had been kind of strange to ring.
As he sat in his armchair, Morse reached idly for the World Atlas from his large bookshelf. And where was Kerry? Oh, yes, over there, west of Tralee. And he moved his finger up the coast to Galway Bay. Then he saw it. Burtnaboy Bay. And suddenly the thought of going over to Connemara seemed overwhelmingly attractive. What, he wondered, was the routine in the Irish Republic for exhumation? Sergeant Lewis called round at 7:30 p.m. Not till the archers had finished had been his strict instruction. He himself had made an interesting little discovery. Well, the WPC and St. Aldate's had made it, really, and he was hoping that it might amuse Morse in his wholly inconsequential game of Find Joanna Franks. But to witness Morse galloping ahead of the hunt, chasing, as Lewis was fairly certain, after some imaginary fox of his own, was, if not unusual, just a little disconcerting. You see, Lewis, Morse was straightway in full swing. This is one of the most beautiful little deceptions we've ever come across. The problems inherent in the case, almost all of them, are resolved immediately once we take one further step into imaginative improbability. Well, I'm very glad to hear it, mumbled Lewis. It's like this. Once I read that story, I was uneasy about it. I mean, it's the identification bit that worried me, and it would have worried any officer in the force today, you know that. But more significantly, if we consider the psychology of the whole, sir, could we, could you please forget all this psychological referencing? Could you just tell me simply and, oh, I'm boring you. Is that what you're saying? Exactly what I'm saying, sir. Morse nodded to himself happily. Let's put it simply, then. I read a story in hospital. I get interested. I think the wrong people got arrested, and some of them hanged for the murder of that little tart from Liverpool. As I say, I thought the identification of that lady was a bit questionable, and the more I read, the more suspicious I became. You see, you said you get to the point, sir. I thought that Joanna's father... No, look, let's start again. Joanna's father gets a job as an insurance rep. Like most people in that position, he gets a few of his own family, if they're daft enough, to take out a policy with him. He gets a bit of commission, and he's not selling a phony product anyway, is he? I think that both Joanna and her first husband, our conjurer friend, were soon enlisted in the ranks of policyholders. Then times get tough. And to crown all the misfortunes, Mr. Donovan, the greatest man in all the world, goes and dies. And when Joanna's natural grief is abated, she finds she's done very nicely, thank you, out of the insurance taken on his life. She receives £100 with profits on what had been a policy taken out only 2 or 3 years previously. Now, £100 plus in 1850, whenever, was a very considerable sum of money. And Joanna perhaps began at that point to appreciate the potential for malpractice in the system. She began to see the insurance business not only as a potential future benefit, but as an actual present source of profit. So my theory was this. After Donovan's death, when she met and married Franks, one of the first things she insisted on was his taking out a policy, not on his life, but on hers. Her father could, and did, effect such a transaction without any trouble, though it was probably soon after this that the Notts and Midland Friendly Society got a little suspicious about Joanna's father, Carrick, Daniel Carrick, and told him his services were no longer... Sir... Morse held up his right hand. Look, Joanna Franks was never murdered, Lewis. She was the mastermind, the mistress mind, behind a deception that was going to rake in some considerable and desperately needed profit. It was another woman, roughly the same age and height, who was found in the Oxford Canal. A woman provided by Joanna's second husband, the ostler from Edgware Road, who had already made the journey, not difficult for him, with horse and carriage from London, to join his wife at Oxford. Or to be more accurate, Lewis, at some few points north of Oxford.
You remember in the Colonel's book, Morse turned to the pages he had in mind. Here it is. He explained how in consequence of some information he had come to in Oxfordshire. Bloody liar. Lewis, now interested despite himself, nodded a vague concurrence of thought. So what you're saying, sir, is that Joanna worked this insurance fiddle and probably made quite a nice little packet for herself and for her father as well. Yes, but not only that. My theory is even more interesting. Listen. I may be wrong, Lewis, but I think that not only was the body wrongly identified as Joanna, lawful wife of Charles Franks, the same Charles Franks who did the identifying, incidentally, but I also think that Charles Franks was the only husband of the woman supposedly murdered on the Barbara Bray. In short, the Charles Franks who broke down in tears at the second trial was none other than Donovan. Phew. A man of many parts. He was an actor, he was a conjurer, he was an impersonator, he was a swindler, he was a cunning schemer, he was a callous murderer. But he was a tearful witness. He was the first and only husband of Joanna Franks, F.T. Donovan, the greatest man in all the world, the man supposedly buried out on the west coast of Ireland, where the breakers come rolling in from the Atlantic. So they tell me. Lewis was silent. How else? He had a precious little piece of evidence in his pocket, but while Morse's mind was coursing through the upper atmosphere, there was little point in interrupting again for the minute. He put the envelope containing the single photocopied sheet on the coffee table and listened further. In the account of Joanna's last few days, we read that at some point she kept calling out her husband's name. Franks, 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 agreed. But she wasn't calling out that at all. She was calling her first husband. I was sitting here thinking of Waggy Greenaway, W.A. Greenaway, you see, and I thought of F.T. Donovan, F.T. Donovan. And I'll put my next month's salary on the F standing for Frank. Huh. Who's ever heard of a wife calling her husband by his surname? I have, sir. Nonsense, not these days. But it's not these days. She was calling Frank Donovan, believe me. But she could have been queer in the head, and if so, nonsense. Well, we shall never know for sure, shall we, sir? Nonsense. Morse sat back with a satisfied, authoritative air of a man who believes that what he has called nonsense 3 times must, by the laws of the universe, be untrue. Lewis didn't give him a chance to get started again. He proffered his envelope. Morse slowly withdrew and studied the photocopied sheet. The original had been handwritten in a flowing cursive style. It read as follows. 25 minutes past 7 o'clock. Drowned body was in cut of water licensed to Duke of Marlborough. Taken to Plough Inn at Wolvercote. Probably identity unknown. Prelim findings would suggest death by drowning. No obvious injury was seen. Height, 5 foot, 3 3/4 inches. Well nourished, circa 35 years of age. Bruise on mouth at side. Fully clothed, no bonnet or shoes. Face discoloured, black. Not the coroner's report, sir, said Lewis, but the next best thing. This fellow must have seen her before the post-mortem. Interesting, isn't it? Very interesting, Morse agreed. After Lewis had gone, he made a phone call. What was the average height of a woman in the 19th century? Well, which end of the 19th century, Morse? The middle. Well, it varied. Oh, come on. Poor food, lack of protein, all that sort of stuff. Not very big, most of them. Certainly no bigger than the Rippers' victims in the 1880s. 4'9", 4'10", 4'11". Well, that sort of height. That's about what those dear ladies were. Except one. Stride. Wasn't that her name? Yeah, Liz Stride. They called her Long Liz. So much taller than all the other women in the workhouses. You follow that, Morse? How tall was she, Long Liz? Dunno. Can you find out? Morse was 3 minutes into the love duet from Act 1 of Die Valkyrie when the phone rang. Morse? 5'3". Morse whistled. Pardon? Thanks, Max. By the way, are you at the lab all day tomorrow? Something I want to show you. So the petite little figure had measured 3/4 of an inch more than Longley's stride, and her shoes, as Lewis had ascertained, approximated to size 5. Well, well, well. Virtually every fact now being unearthed, though that was probably not the mot juste, was bolstering Morse's bold hypothesis. But infuriatingly, there was, as it seemed, no chance whatever of establishing the truth. Not at any rate the truth regarding Joanna Franks, because her grave was lost forever under a housing development. Even the headstone which had caught the eye of the late lamented Colonel Denniston had been consigned to oblivion. This Morse knew because it was another thing which Sergeant Lewis had checked. The next morning brought a communication from Morse's insurance company, a third and final demand for his previous month's premium. Morse wrote out a cheque and a brief letter of apology. Coincidental, for he'd been talking to Lewis about insurance only the previous evening, and he admitted it to himself, largely making it up as he went along. But it was far from improbable, wasn't it? What he had guessed. Those insurance fiddles. He looked up the first material that Christine had brought into him at the JR2, and once again studied the facts and figures of the Nottinghamshire and Midlands Friendly Society for 1859. Joanna had been born in 1821, so she was 38 in 1859. If she had taken out a policy a year, 2 years earlier, that would be age, next birthday 36, an annual premium of £3, 8 shillings and 9 pence, under £7. Under £7, say, for a return of £100. That's not bad at all. And if Donovan had already pocketed a similar packet... Morse left his flat in mid-morning, his first excursion since his return, and posted his letter. There was a travel agency immediately across the street, and the girl who sat at the first desk to the right smiled brightly. Can I help, sir? Yes, I'd like to book a holiday with a car in Ireland, the Republic, that is. Later that morning, he called at the William Dunn School of Pathology in South Parks Road. Have a look at these for me, will you? Refraining from all cynical comment, Max looked dubiously across at Morse over his half lenses. Max, all I want to know is whether they come from M&S or Littlewoods. The tear, Max, the tear. Tear? What tear? Max picked up the knickers with some distaste and examined them, as it seemed to Morse, in cursory fashion. No tear here, Morse, not the faintest sign of any irregular distension of the fibre tissue. Calico, by the way, isn't there? Yeah, I think so. Well, we don't need a microscope to tell us it's a cut. Neat, clean, straightforward cut. All right? With a knife? Well, what the hell else do you cut things with? Cheese slicer? A pair of... What a wonderful thing, Morse, is the human imagination. The man parking his Lancia, Inspector Mulvaney knew to be the English policeman who had rung the previous day to ask for help in locating a cemetery, for as yet no stated purpose, and who thought it was probably the one overlooking Burtnaboy Bay, that being the only burial ground marked on the local map. Mulvaney had been able to assure Chief Inspector Morse that indeed it would be the cemetery which lay on the side of a hill to the west of the small town. The local dead were always likely to be buried there, Mulvaney had maintained, there being no alternative accommodation. From the window of his office, Mulvaney watched Morse with some curiosity. The man who was walking round to the main entrance looked an interesting specimen, mid-50s, losing his whitish hair, putting on just a little too much weight, and exhibiting perhaps, as was to be hoped, the telltale signs of more than a little. Nor was Mulvaney disappointed in the man who was shown in. Are you related to Kipling's, Mulvaney? Asked Morse. No, sir, but that was a good question. An education...
Well, that's a good thing, sir. Morse explained his unlikely, ridiculous, selfish mission, and Mulvaney warmed to him immediately. No chance whatsoever, of course, of any exhumation order being granted, but perhaps Morse might be interested in hearing about the business of grave digging in the Republic. A man could never dig a grave on a Monday, and that for perfectly valid reasons which he'd forgotten. And in any case, it wasn't Monday, was it? And it was always the custom for the chief mourner to supply a little quantity of Irish whiskey at the graveside for the other mourners, and for the grave diggers too. For sure, 'tis always a thirsty business. So Morse, the chief mourner, walked out into the high street and purchased 3 bottles of Irish malt. An understanding had been arrived at, and Morse knew that whatever the problems posed by the Donovan-Franks equation, the left-hand side would be solved, if solved it would be, with the full cooperation of the Irish Garda. In all, there must have been about 300 or 400 graves within the walled area of the hillside cemetery. Half a dozen splendidly sculpted angels and Madonnas kept watch here and there over a few former dignitaries, and several large Celtic crosses marked other burial plots. But the great majority of the dead lay unhonoured here, beneath untended, meaner-looking memorials. Donovan Stone was one of the latter, a poor mossed and lichen thing, with white and ochre blotches, and no more than 2 feet high, leaning back at an angle of about 20 degrees from the vertical. So effaced was the weathered stone that only the general outline of the lettering could be followed, and that only on either side of the central disintegration. "That's him," said Morse triumphantly. "It looks as if his first name had been Frank. F.R. something anyway. God rest his soul," added Mulvaney. "That's if it's there, of course." Morse grinned and wished he'd known Mulvaney long ago. "How were you going to explain?" "Oh, well, we were just digging another grave, sir, in the daylight and just as normal. A new grave, and who's to dispute us?" It was all quite quick. Mulvaney had bidden the 2 men appointed to the task to dig a clean rectangle to the east of the stone, and after getting down only 2 or 3 feet, one of the spades struck what sounded like and was soon revealed to be a wooden coffin. Once all the dark earth had been removed and piled on each side of the oblong pit, Morse and Mulvaney looked down to a plain coffin top with no plate of any sort screwed onto it. The wood, 1-inch elm boarding and grooved round the top, looked badly warped, but in reasonable state. It was Mulvaney himself, awkwardly straddling the hole, his shoes caked with mud, who bent down and pulled at the top of the coffin, which gave way easily, the metal screws clearly having disintegrated long ago. As the boards slowly lifted, Mulvaney saw, as did Morse, that a whitish mould hung down from the inside of the coffin lid, and in the coffin itself a shroud or covering was overspread with the same creeping white fungus. Round the sides of the bottom of the coffin, plain for all to see, was a bed of brownish, dampish sawdust, looking as fresh as if it had been buried only yesterday. "'Tis a wonderful well preserved, is it not, sir? 'Tis the peat in the soil that's accounting for it." This from the first grave digger, who appeared more deeply impressed by the wondrous preservation of wood than by the absence of any body. For the coffin contained no body at all. What it did contain was a roll of carpet of some greenish dye, about 5 feet in length, folded round what appeared to have been a dozen spaded squares of peat. Of Donovan, there was no trace whatsoever. 95% certain as he was that the wrong people had been hanged in 1860, there was apparently nothing further he could do to dispel that worrying little 5% of doubt. It was on Friday the 15th of December that Morse's eye caught the name in the Oxford Times deaths column. Denniston, Marjorie. On December the 10th, peacefully at her home in Woodstock, aged 78 years. She wished her body to be given to medical research, donations gratefully received, in honour of the late Colonel W.M. Denniston by the British Legion Club, Lambourne. Morse thought back to the only time he'd met the quaint old girl.
so proud as she had been of her husband's work, a work which had brought Morse such disproportionate interest, a work which he did not even have to pay for. He signed a cheque for £20 and stuck it in a cheap brown envelope. He had both first and second class stamps to hand, but he chose a second class. It wasn't a matter of life and death after all. He looked up the British Legion's Lambourne address in the telephone directory, and after doing so turned to Denniston, WM. There it was, 46 Church Walk, Woodstock. Had there been any family? It hardly appeared so from the obituary notice. So what happened to things if there was no one to leave them to? It was a grey stone terraced house. He knocked on the front door and was admitted forthwith. 2 persons were in the house. A young man in his middle 20s who, as he explained, had been commissioned by Blackwell's to catalogue the few semi-valuable books on the late Denniston's shelves, and a great-nephew of the old colonel, the only surviving relative. To the latter, Morse immediately and openly explained what his interest was. He was begging the opportunity to discover whether the late colonel had left behind any notes or documents relating to murder on the Oxford Canal, and happily the answer was yes. In the study was a pile of manuscript and typescript, and clipped to an early page of the manuscript was one short letter, a letter with no date, no sender's address, and no envelope. "Our dear Daniel," it began, "we do trust you are keeping well these past few months. We shall be in Derby in early September, when we hope we shall be with you. Please say to Mary how the dress she did was very successful, and will she go on with the other one if she is feeling recovered? Yours truly and affectionately, Matthew." There was only one Daniel in the case. Daniel Carrick from Derby, Joanna's father. And he was that one piece of primary source material that linked the colonel's narrative in a tangible, physical way to the whole sorry story. Daniel Carrick was surely just as damningly implicated as the other 2 in the deception, the twin deception, which had seen the Notts and Midland Friendly Society having to fork out, first for the death of the great uncoffined Donovan, and then for the death of the enigmatic Joanna, the great undrowned. Morse turned over the faded, deeply creased letter and saw on the back a penciled note, pretty certainly in the colonel's hand. No records from insurance company, 12 Spring Street, still occupied, 12th of the 4th, 76. Since fast driving was his only significant vice, Sergeant Lewis was delighted, albeit on one of his rests, invited to drive Morse's Lancia. The object of the mission was to find out if a thoroughfare called Spring Street still stood, as it had stood until 1976, on the northern outskirts of Derby. "Just humour me, Lewis, that's all I ask," Morse had said. Lewis had needed little persuasion, and now, moving the Lancia across the fast lane of the M1 at Weedon, he felt wholly content. Spring Street proved difficult to locate, in spite of a city map purchased from a corner newsagent in the northern suburbs. Finally, however, the Lancia homed in on an area marked off by hoardings, announcing itself as the Derby Development Complex, with 2 enormously tall yellow cranes tracing and retracing their sweeping arcs above the demolition squads below. Lewis drew into the curb. Morse wound down his window and spoke to a brick-dusted, white-helmeted workman. "Have you flattened Spring Street yet?" "Won't be long, mate," the man replied, pointing towards the next but one block of terraced houses. Lewis was soon pulling the Lancia in behind a builder's skip a couple of streets away. The young coloured woman pushing a utility pram assured Morse that, yes, this was Spring Street, and the 2 men got out of the car. Built by the look of them in the early 1800s, many of the houses were now semi-derelict, and several boarded up completely. A few remained tenanted, for here and there smoke rose up into the grey air from the narrow yellow chimney pots, and white lace curtains still framed the windows yet unbroken. Morse walked slowly along, before stopping before a front door painted in what 50 years earlier had been Cambridge blue, and into which a number plaque 20 was screwed. The house was in a terraced group of 6. Walking further along, Morse came to a door of an abandoned property on which, judging from the outlines, the figure 16 had once been fixed. Here Morse stopped and beckoned to Lewis. The eyes of both now travelled to the 2 adjacent houses boarded up against squatters or vandals. The first must, without question, have been number 14, and the second, number 12. The latter, the sorry-looking object of Morse's pilgrimage, stood on the corner, the sign Burton Road still fastened to its side wall, although no sign of Burton Road itself was any longer visible. Below the sign, a wooden gate hanging forlornly from one of its rusted hinges led to a small patch of backyard choked with litter and weeds. The single window frame had been completely torn away, leaving the inside of the mean little abode open to the elements. Morse poked his face over the blackened sill before turning away in disgust. In one corner of the erstwhile kitchen was what appeared to be a pile of excrement, and beside it half a loaf of white bread, its slices curled and mildew green. "Not a pretty sight, is it?" whispered Lewis, standing at Morse's shoulder. "She was brought up here," said Morse quietly. "She lived here with her mother and her father." "And her brother," added Lewis. "Yes." Morse had forgotten the brother, Joanna's younger brother, the boy named after his father, forgotten him altogether. Morse left the small backyard and slowly walked round to the front again, where he stood in the middle of the deserted street and looked at the little terrace house in which Joanna Carrick Donovan Franks had probably spent, the first 20 or so years of her life. Had she spent those 20 years in and around that poky little kitchen, competing for space with the sink and the copper and the mangle and the cooking range and her parents and her younger brother? Lewis had been talking while these and similar thoughts were crossing and recrossing Morse's mind, and he hadn't heard a word of what was said. Pardon, Lewis? I just say, that's what we used to do, that's all. Over the top of the head and put the date against it. Morse, unable to construe such manifest gobbledygook, nodded as if with full understanding and led the way to the car. "Where to now, sir?" "Straight home, I think. Unless there's something you want to see." Morse was silent as Lewis drove the few miles out to the motorway. Then he said, "What was it you were saying back there?" "You mean when you weren't listening?" "Oh, just tell me, Lewis." "It was just when we were children, that's all. We used to measure how tall we were getting. Mum always used to do it every birthday against the kitchen wall. I suppose that's what reminded me, really, looking in that kitchen. Not in the front room, I mean, that was the best wallpaper there. And as I say, she used to put a ruler over the top of our heads, you know, and then put a line and a date." Again Morse was not listening. "Lewis, turn round and go back." Morse's finger on the kitchen switch produced only an empty click, in spite of what looked like a recent bulb in the fixture that hung shadeless from the disintegrating plasterboards. The yellowing paper had been peeled away from several sections of the wall in irregular gashes, and in the damp top corner above the sink it hung away in a great flap. "Whereabouts did you use to measure things, Lewis?" "About here, sir." Lewis stood against the inner door of the kitchen, his back to the wall, where he placed his left palm horizontally across the top of his head before turning round and assessing the point at which his fingertips had marked the height. 5'11", that is, unless I've shrunk a bit. The wallpaper at this point was grubby with a myriad fingerprints, appearing not to have been renovated for half a century or more. And around the non-functioning light switch the plaster had been knocked out, exposing some of the bricks in the partition wall. Morse tore a strip from the yellow paper to reveal a surprisingly well-preserved light blue paper beneath. But marked memorials to Joanna there were none, and the two men stood silent and still there, as the afternoon seemed to grow perceptibly colder and darker by the minute. "It was a thought, though, wasn't it?" said Morse. "A good thought, sir." "Well, one thing's certain. We're not going to stand here all afternoon in the gathering gloom and strip all these walls of generations of wallpaper. Wouldn't take all that long, would it, sir? What? All this bloody stuff? We know where to look. We would. I mean, it's only a little house, and if we just looked along at some point, say, between 4 feet and 5 feet from the ground, downstairs only, I should think, you're a genius. Do you know that? And, you've got a good torch in the car? No, admitted Morse, I'm afraid I haven't. Well, never mind, sir. We've got about half an hour before it gets too dark. It was 20 minutes to 4 when Lewis emitted a squeak of excitement from the narrow hallway. Something here, sir, and I think... Careful, careful, muttered Morse, coming alongside. Gradually the paper was pulled away as the last streaks of that December day filtered through the filthy skylight above the heads of Morse and Lewis, each of them looking occasionally at the other with wholly disproportionate excitement. For there, inscribed on the original plaster of the wall, below 3 layers of subsequent papering and still clearly visible, were 2 sets of black penciled horizontal lines. On the right, there were 8 lines, one above the other, 3 foot 6 inches, the lowest, to about 5 foot, the highest. And just at the point of each line was a date, also in pencil. 1st of Jan was all that was legible beside the lowest line, because the decay of the plaster had obliterated any further marks. Then in ascending order, 1st of Jan 1835 beside the next line, 1st of Jan 1836 beside the next, then 1st of Jan 1837, and so on, year by year in ascending order to 1st of Jan 1841 beside the top pencil line. 6 inches to the left of this was another vertical arrangement of pencil marks, but here a diagonal collapse of the plaster meant that only 2 lines and 4 dates were legible. Reading this column from the bottom upwards, Morse saw Ann 1836, and above that Jan 1837. These 2 were at approximately the same levels as the corresponding dates on the right-hand side. Continuing upwards on the left-hand side, there was a bit of a gap before a pencil line and 1st of Jan 1839, and above that came a line and 1st of Jan 1840/1841. Of these 2, the 1839 entry was a bit lower than the right-hand 1839, and the 1840/41 mark was several inches lower than the right-hand 1841 mark. For some moments Morse stood there in the darkened hallway and gazed upon the wall as if upon some holy relic. Get a torch, Lewis, and a tape measure. Where from? Well, anywhere. Everybody's got a torch, man. Well, except you, sir. Tell them you're from the gas board and there's a leak in number 12. Well, the house isn't on gas. Get on with it, Lewis. When Lewis returned, Morse was still considering his wall marks, beaming as happily as a pool's punter surveying a winning line of score draws on the treble chance. Taking the torch, he played it joyously over the evidence. The new light on the situation quickly confirmed that any writing below the present extent of their findings was irredeemably lost. It also showed a letter between the 2 sets of measurements, low down and slightly towards the right, and therefore probably belonging to the right-hand set. The letter D. Daniel. The lines on the right must mark the height of Daniel Carrick, and if that was so, then those on the left were those of Joanna. Are you thinking what I'm thinking, Lewis? Yes, I reckon so, sir. Joanna married in 1841 or 42. Morse was talking to himself as much as to Lewis, and that fits well because the measurements end in 1841, when she was no taller than she had been in 1840, and her younger brother Daniel was gradually catching her up, about the same height in 1836 and quite a few inches taller in 1841. He took the white tape measure and let it roll out to the floor. Only 5 foot, this. Well, I don't think we're going to need a much longer one, sir. Lewis was right. As Morse held the 0-inches end of the tape to the top of Joanna's putative measurements, Lewis shone the torch on the other end as he knelt on the dirty red tiles. No, a longer tape measure was certainly not needed here, for the height measured only 4 foot 9 inches, and as Lewis knew, the woman who had been pulled out of Duke's Cut had been 5 foot 3 3/4 inches, almost 7 inches taller than Joanna had been after leaving Spring Street for her marriage. Was it possible, even wildly possible, that she had grown those 7 inches between the ages of 21 and 38? Lewis put his thoughts into words. I don't think, sir, that a woman could have... No, Lewis, nor do I. If not impossible, at the very least unprecedented, surely. So you were right, sir. Beyond any reasonable doubt? Yes. Yes, I think so. Beyond all doubt? Asked Lewis quietly. Well, there'll always be that 1% of doubt about most things, I suppose. You'd be happier, though, if... Morse nodded. If we'd found just that one little thing extra, yes. Like a J on the wall here, or... I don't know. There's nothing else to find, then, sir? No, I'm sure there isn't, said Morse. But only after hesitating for just a little while. What do we do now, sir? Morse's mind was far away. It was done a long time ago, Lewis, and done ill, he said slowly. Let's go home. On the morning of Friday, the 11th of January, he had resumed duties on New Year's Day. Morse caught the early Cathedral's express to Paddington. He was programmed to speak on inner city's crimes at 11 a.m. at the Hendon Symposium. He bought the Times and the Oxford Times at the bookstall, got a seat at the rear of the train, and had solved the Times crossword by Didcot, except for one clue. A quick look in his faithful Chambers dictionary would have settled the issue immediately, but he hadn't got it, and as ever he was vexed by his inability to put the finishing touch to anything. At Reading he turned to the Oxford Times crossword. The setter was Quixote, and Morse smiled to himself as he remembered Waggy Greenaway finally solving the same set as Bradman's famous duck, 6 letters, and writing in Donald at 1 across. Nothing quite so amusing here, but a very nice puzzle. 12 minutes to complete? Well, not bad. Morse took a sheet of paper from his briefcase, first looking through the alphabetical list of those who would be attending the conference. Nobody he knew in the A to D range, then he scanned the E to F. Eagleston, Ellis, Emmett, Erskine, Farmer, Favant, Fielding... Tom Eagleston, yes, and Jack Farmer, yes, and Morse stopped and looked again at the middle of the 3 delegates in the Fs. The name was vaguely familiar, yet he couldn't remember where. And then he remembered. Yes, it was the name of the man who had been walking along the Oxford Canal at the time when Joanna Franks was murdered. When Joanna Franks was supposedly murdered, the man... perhaps who had been traced to the Nag's Head, where he'd signed the register. A mystery man. Maybe not his real name at all, for the canal had been full of men who had used an alias. In fact, as Morse recollected, 2 of the crew of the Barbara Bray itself had done so. Alfred Musson, alias Alfred Brotherton, Walter Towns, alias Walter Thorold. It might well be of some deep psychological significance that criminals sometimes seem most unwilling to give up their original names, even if this involved a greater risk of future identification. Morse had known it quite often. It was as if a man's name were almost an intrinsic part of him, as if he could never shed it completely. Musson had kept his Christian name, hadn't he? So had Towns. Morse spent the rest of the journey looking idly, his brain tidying up a few scattered thoughts as the train drew into Paddington. Donald Bradman. Don Bradman. The name by which everybody recognized the greatest batsman ever born, and F.T. Donovan, the greatest man in the world, and Ye gods. He remembered the man who had identified the body of Joanna Franks. The man who had been physically incapable, as it seemed, of raising his eyes to look into the faces of the prisoners. The man who had held his hands to his own face as he wept and turned his back on the men arraigned before the court. Why did he do these things? Morse. Because, yes, because the boatman might just have recognized him. For they had seen him, albeit fleetingly, in the dawn as he had made to get further on his way with all speed. Donald Favant, or Don Favant, as he would certainly have seen himself. Morse wrote out those letters, D-O-N-F-A-V-A-N-T, along the bottom margin of the Oxford Times, and then below them, the name of which they were the anagram, the name of F.T. Donovan, the greatest man in all the world.